Well, you've seen the title of this video, so let's just get right to it. If you're here, I'm assuming that you've played and beaten Final Fantasy VII Remake, and if you haven't, well, consider this your spoiler warning. Not just for Remake, but for all of these works as well. Don't worry though, I'll put a link to a list of timestamps in the description so you can avoid them. I know I'm really late to the party with this video, but, you know, better late than never. Okay, a little background. The Final Fantasy series is one of the oldest and most iconic franchises in the entire history of gaming, well known for codifying Japanese role-playing games and popularizing the genre in the West. For years, the series' owner, Squaresoft, now known as Square Enix, was at the top of its game, completely dominating the market in terms of storytelling and showcasing the true potential of video games as an art form. Unfortunately, however, there are few things in this world that are even capable of maintaining such a high status, so it was only a matter of time until Final Fantasy would begin running out of steam. The general consensus among fans is that the series reached its golden age in the mid to late 90s with such critically acclaimed titles as Final Fantasy VI, X, 8, 9, and especially 7, only to then face a major decline beginning somewhere around the turn of the millennium. Final Fantasy X-2, 12, 13 and its spin-offs, and Final Fantasy 15 were all commercially successful, but they drew increasingly mixed reactions from players for a variety of reasons, all while longtime fans were left begging for a high-definition remake of Final Fantasy VII, which retained the story of the original, only with modern graphics and updated gameplay. Such demands were only intensified by the release of numerous spin-off games and a tie-in movie, each of which seemed to miss the appeal of the original and consequently drew mixed responses, both from newcomers and series loyalists alike. But then, in June of 2015, a bomb dropped. We at last got a special announcement at Sony's E3 press conference that Final Fantasy VII Remake was actually happening for real, and audiences everywhere began creaming their jeans in excitement. But then, following a brief gameplay trailer at PSX that same year, development on Remake went mysteriously silent, with the only substantive news being that the whole project was going to be spread out across multiple different parts, something which has inevitably divided fans. But come E3 of 2019, and nearly all fears were alleviated. We finally got a massive reveal showcasing not just the gameplay, but the story and characters like we had never seen them before, and yet in a way which was somehow faithful to how we had always imagined them.
Have you been a good girl?
The following months saw a modest drip feed of trailers and other marketing materials, after which the game finally released in April 2020 to high sales and overwhelming critical acclaim, with the only significant criticisms being that it often felt padded, in addition to having a controversial twist ending that completely overrides the plot of the original game. Now, I for one was able to avoid spoilers while going into FF7 Remake. I mean, I already knew that Sephiroth was the final boss and all, but I didn't find that to be much of a deal breaker. I just assumed that it was going to be one of Jenova's spawn, shapeshifted to look like Sephiroth. Meanwhile, most of the other rumors that I'd heard about this game being a sequel or whatever, it all just seems so outlandish that I dismissed them, and I kind of went into the game blind. Now, after having beaten the game twice and had nearly 3 years to mull it over, I feel conflicted. I mean, on the one hand, I am curious to find out what will happen next, but I'm not excited. I'm disillusioned, really, which is probably not the reaction that Square Enix was hoping for me to have. It's abundantly clear that their goal with this ending was to more or less ape the formula employed by such works as Westworld, Kingdom Hearts, anything Chris Carter or J.J. Abrams have made over the years, etc. That formula, of course, being to leave each new installment on some open-ended cliffhanger that will keep fans guessing, and thereby retain hype and investment right up until the next entry comes out. And just so we're clear, I'm not trying to be contrarian, even though I am no stranger to having unpopular opinions. I know full well that the majority of fans were okay with this ending. Heck, FF Union polled over 14,000 individuals who played Remake and found that at least 74% of them were satisfied by it. However, it's worth understanding that while that number might seem high initially, it's still far from ideal. Now, I'm not saying that this poll is reflective of the entire Remake player base at large. Obviously, no one can prove whether that 25% figure is accurate or not, but in my experience, I have seen a lot of fans angrily commenting on how much they loved the game right up until the final chapter, after which they turned on it and expressed that they have no interest in future installments if the ending is a sign of where this series is headed. Even professional critics who are often stereotyped as rewarding each and every AAA game with praise were still ambivalent towards the ending and whether it could negatively impact the series going forward, as were influencers like Soldier First Class, Night Sky Prince, Mugen Lord, Super Eye Patch Wolf, Dreamcast Guy, Never Knows Best, Robot Co-op, and Resonant Arc, with the latter two even feeling so let down by it that they've sworn off the series altogether. Meanwhile, the rest have had to deal with a barrage of unearned shit and toxicity just for voicing their mere concerns about the new direction.
When you decide that you are going to harass somebody to the point of taking screenshots of shit they said 10 years ago and posting that on social media to try to blackmail people into liking the things that you like, or contacting your sponsors, had that happen. Had some of my friends get threatened that they were going to get calls at their work and their bosses were going to get told to fire them for misconduct of some kind. People emailing Square Enix attempting to get me pulled from sponsorships because I said something they didn't like. This is insane shit.
Now, thankfully, the flames do seem to have died down over the past several months, but I'd argue that the amount of vitriol we've seen targeted at those who dare criticize the ending is proof enough that something is seriously wrong here. I mean, honestly, how little confidence must you have in your own opinions/preferences that you need to go out of your way to harass and, by extension, silence those whose thoughts aren't an immediate validation of your own? You might try and argue that I'm the one being toxic for, open quotes, ruining everyone's fun, but if that's how you feel, then why are you even here? If you've already convinced yourself that you love Remake and cannot stand to hear anyone criticize it, then by all means, close the webpage. Do something else. Why is your enjoyment of something wholly contingent on unorthodox views being silenced? If you sincerely feel as though all criticism is toxic, if you cannot remain civil towards those with whom you disagree, and if the best you can offer are informal fallacies and ad hominem attacks against those who dislike something you love, then is that not proof you can't come up with a good counter-argument? Is there not perhaps the possibility, just the slightest possibility, that you're in denial? Could it not in fact be post-purchase rationalization? That is of course begging the question, however, so I won't dwell on it. It's at this point that I should probably clarify a few things, and I figure it's best if I speak in person for it, freakish as I might look. I want to make clear that, despite my harsh tone, I in no way wish to imply that all, or even most of the people who like Remake are kidding themselves. That would just be arrogantly presumptuous of me and also disparaging. I'm sure many, if not most of you watching this, have perfectly valid reasons for liking the new direction. I'm not here to judge you or accuse anyone of having bad tastes. If you personally like the ending, yet can respectfully disagree with those of us who don't, then I welcome you and I wish you all the best. I also don't wish to imply that detractors like me have been saints in this whole controversy either. There's faulty reasoning and toxicity on both sides, some of which even I've been guilty of. However, seeing as people who like Remake's changes far outnumber those who don't, I'm gonna have to spend most of my time addressing the former rather than the latter. And just as an aside, in case you were wondering, yes, I have seen that Easy Allies podcast, and no, it hasn't changed my stance on Remake. I get that most of you Maximilian fans out there are just trying to help those of us who were disappointed by the ending, and your concern is appreciated. However, for me personally, Max's theories might have actually made things worse. for reasons which I'll be delving into eventually. So again, when I do accuse anyone of toxicity or perhaps being in denial, I am not talking about the majority of remake players out there. I am referring only to a specific subset of toxic fans who are so insecure in their opinions that they can't even handle it when someone else doesn't like it. The ones who resort to ad hominem attacks and logical fallacies to harass and discredit those whose opinions don't align with their own. Unfortunately, however, while said fans do comprise only a minority of the player base, their arguments, on the other hand, have become so familiar at this point that one can no longer critique Remake without also refuting some of the more common amongst them. Heck, one YouTuber, Orion85, even did an entire video dedicated to precisely that. So before anyone here starts commenting on how a one-to-one remake would be boring, or I have to wait until part 2 before I can accurately judge part 1, please watch his video first. I'm being serious, by the way. Pause this video and go check it out. Get back to me when you can.
Regardless of dictionary definitions and interpretations, it's incredibly disingenuous and dishonest of Remake fans to report that they expected changes of this scale when they first saw the word remake appear at that E3 conference back in 2015. But fans act like the level of changes we received in the finished product should have been obvious. That Square Enix's comments of, "we'll be making some changes," should have been enough for original game fans to get the message that things are about to go a bit crazy. It's a strange hill to die on. You're essentially telling us that even though we're unhappy, we should have expected to be unhappy. So it's our fault, really. And that somehow makes everything okay and invalidates our criticisms. The problem there is Square Enix came looking for us. Their marketing campaign cast the widest net it possibly could, hoping to draw back those mainstream and or casual gamers, or those fans who loved Final Fantasy in the 90s but drifted away. But now you're telling me those fans can't voice their criticism? After all the years of hype and promise, now you expect to dismiss those people with, "go play the original"? Yes, the original game is always there, but try hyping yourself up for something for 5 years and then scrubbing it from your memory entirely.
I'll do my best to refute those same arguments here as well, but it would sure save me a lot of time and energy in my own comment space regardless. Because honestly, these retorts have become so familiar to me by now that I am completely sick of them. Yes, the original game still exists. That doesn't change anything, because to pretend as though you can compare a game from 1997 to a game from 2020 is intellectual dishonesty, to say the least. In fact, if I remember correctly, the reason people were asking for a remake for so long is because the original FF7 had an amazing story which was limited by the technology of its time, and we all wanted to see that story get an update with modern gameplay and voice acting, along the lines of Crisis Core and Advent Children. Heck, that's pretty much all I can remember fans talking about before this ending became known unto the world. To argue that it doesn't matter if fans are upset because the original still exists is to also argue that those same fans were never asking for Remake to exist, which is demonstrably fallacious. Likewise, the claim that a faithful adaptation would be boring and that Square needed to overhaul the story implies two things. One, that no one was excited for Remake before this ending became known unto the world, and two, that every single adaptation of any known work or historical event is inherently boring to those familiar with it, neither of which is true. Remake was already providing us with a fun and riveting experience long before these late-game story changes entered the picture, and I, for one, can name countless works of entertainment which I love despite, or perhaps even because, I already knew what happened going in, including the original FF7. And on that note, yes, I agree. 90% of this game was an almost perfect adaptation of the original. I think very few would argue with that. However, this too doesn't change anything because the ratio of faithful to unfaithfulness is not the issue here. The issue is in how the ending recontextualizes the story in a way which ruined many players' experiences. Endings are arguably the most important part of any narrative after all, because they provide the very payoff to which everything else in the story has been building up to that point. If you screw up the ending and thereby recontextualize things for the worse, it cripples the experience overall. overall. It makes viewers feel as though all their time and investment was for nothing. The contexts in which story beats occur are just as important, if not more, than the individual plot points themselves.
They're not necessarily.
Well, that's the double-edged sword, though, of how faithful it was for the most part, for like 90% of the game, how faithful it was, because it does give that tantalizing, like, this is what it, could be, but then it kind of rips it away. So I think that's where some people are coming from, where it's like, it was so fucking close to exactly what I wanted, and then it, hard swerved.
Yeah,
at
the
very end.
I think that's where, like, depending on how either you fell on your feet and you're like, okay, cool, we'll see what comes next, or you fell fucking right on your ass and you're like, wow, that sucked.
Almost 75% of respondents rated it as a 4 or 5 out of 5, and this then saw a natural decline into the lower numbers. But if we average out the scores, we end up with a 3.93 or 79%, and if we're referring back to the initial set of elements, that ranks the ending as the third worst aspect of the game, and such was its impact that it affected enjoyment of the game as a whole. How people scored the ending had a direct correlation with how they scored every other aspect of the game, irrespective of whether it related to the story.
But more on that later. And just so we're clear, no, I am not some purist who only wanted a one-to-one remaster of the OG. I can't speak for everyone, but I personally never wanted this game to be a shot-for-shot remake, nor do I believe it will faithfully retell the narrative of the original anymore. On the contrary, I wholly anticipate that the narratives of Part 3 and Rebirth will deviate significantly from that of the OG at this point. And you know what? I'm content with that. No, really, I'm being serious. It may come as a surprise given everything that I've said thus far, but I have come to terms with the fact that Remake is telling its own story. It's sad to admit, but I have accepted the fact that we are never going to get a truly faithful retelling of Final Fantasy VII with modern technology. That is not my utmost concern anymore. My main concern is in regards to how Remake's changes will affect the quality of the storytelling going forward, whether they will be for the better or for the worse, whether they will complement or denigrate that of the OG, and if the direction it takes will either bring people around or alienate all but the most dissenting within the fandom. See, what we all need to recognize is that just because Remake has been well received by the majority of fans, doesn't guarantee that future installments will be anywhere near as critically or commercially successful, because devoted fans are not the only ones buying these games. I can assure you that a sizable portion of those who played Remake are either fresh newcomers with no prior experience with Final Fantasy, or, and I mean no disrespect to anyone when I say this, more fickle players who aren't so obliging as to follow the Remake series wherever it goes story-wise. Most industries tend to have a sharp divide in their customer base between those fans who will buy and accept anything so long as it carries a certain brand that they love, and the other, less obliging fans who will come and go depending on whether their interests are met. And it is the latter demographic which I am talking about here. I have my own personal complaints surrounding this ending, which I will delve into soon enough, but please understand that the point of this video isn't to, open quotes, ruin the Remake series for others, as if that claim weren't weak enough to begin with. My goal, above all else, is merely to provide an understanding, to explain why many players were put off by Remake's changes using myself and others as a case study. And by that I mean for reasons other than the story just being different. And I know that may sound rather conceited, but don't worry, I haven't forgotten that I ultimately am just some randy on the internet. Though I believe my experience is similar to that of many players, I do not speak for every fan who was let down by this ending. I can only speak for a proportion of them at most. Likewise, no one's saying you have to agree with my critique, nor do I wish to imply that you're wrong or should in any way feel bad for liking this game. If you personally enjoy Remake, then my thoughts on the matter shouldn't affect yours. What I will suggest, however, is that we should at least exhibit some skepticism moving forward, because to not temper one's expectations is to usually set oneself up for disappointment. I know a lot of fans have, open quotes, faith in Square Enix because many of the staff who made the original have also come back to work on Remake, but let's not forget that their track records haven't been stellar for almost 2 decades now, and just because the original creators are returning after that time, doesn't guarantee that what they make now is going to be a triumph. It's not uncommon for artists to unintentionally screw up their own work after all, so even if you did like this ending, you might still want to watch this video, if you feel like it. That way you won't be as let down as I was in the possible case that this all ends badly, because I do suspect that a lot of players who like Remake now might still turn on it eventually.
After I released a video about my concerns for the Final Fantasy VII Remake narrative moving forward into the second part, someone had pretty much stated in the comment section that Maximilian pretty much has the entire Final Fantasy VII Remake story figured out and that we should be excited for this new direction. But what's dangerous about this is, even though he isn't intentionally trying to build false expectation, his name and his influence has such a huge impact on how people feel about the game. Theory crafting can also hurt a franchise moving forward, because fans have built this false anticipation of an outcome that doesn't even come close to what the developers have in mind. So what happens when the developer's plot point doesn't deliver or meet the expectations of your own theories or the YouTubers' theories? The game will pretty much get destroyed by the fans and create an undesirable outcome that was not intended by the developers themselves. The game becomes judged by a theorized narrative instead of the intended narrative.
So, to kick things off, I began working on this project way back in June of 2020 and had initially planned for it to be a much shorter video, but that was before I realized just how much I had to say about this whole thing. So I then decided I would be releasing this thing in parts. I know, the irony is not lost on me at all, with part 1 being this video and part 2 ideally coming out sometime afterward. Unfortunately, however, organizing my thoughts on this game has taken an obscene amount of time, and though a follow-up video would certainly be more efficient to make than this one, since I finally have some idea of what I'm doing now, it is unlikely that I'd be able to get it done before the next game, Rebirth, launches. Thus, with all that in mind, my goal for right now is only to get this video done and uploaded. My hope with this critique is that I'll be able to cover such topics as when I think changes are good versus when I think they are bad, why this ending left such a bad impression on me personally, how its issues could either be addressed or get further out of hand in the forthcoming installments, how writers can go too far in encouraging fans to theory craft, and also delve into some of the more fundamental questions like what I and many other players look for in storytelling, how suspension of disbelief works, and why my suspension of disbelief was shattered by Remake's final chapter. Also, to this end, I will be drawing numerous parallels to other works and franchises where appropriate, and this project overall is going to be heavily annotated, with all sources cited and additional points appearing in the form of a number in the bottom right corner of the screen, and the corresponding sources/footnotes appearing in a Google Doc, which I will link in the description box below. Now, with that, I do need to clarify that my goal with this project isn't to say, oh, those who disagree with me have poor taste in entertainment. Not at all. The question as to what makes a story good or bad is inherently subjective. What some find enjoyable might in fact be a total deal breaker for others, and vice versa. All I'm suggesting is that they should be careful not to alienate any particular subset of their audience. That they should at least be wary of certain tropes and conventions which some in their customer base might perceive as off-putting. That doesn't mean the devs should start pandering to the audience or otherwise water down their work just to appease the lowest common denominator. No, far from it. We all know it's bad when executives start forcing artists to compromise their visions for the sake of pleasing algorithms. However, the inverse can be a problem as well, when artists get so caught up in their own esoteric vision that they run into the law of diminishing returns, when they have defied so many storytelling conventions that they end up alienating all but the most tolerant of audience members. And I fear that Remake's story changes may be landing this series in the latter such scenario. And it would be a real shame if the Remake series were to only end up satisfying an ever-diminishing subset of fans for reasons which could have easily been avoided had the devs just stuck to the story that we all know and love. So, to bring us back around, this video is not intended as a polemic against those who did like Remake's change in direction. It's more of a, hermit's advice on how to tell a multi-part story which is emotionally resonant while also alienating as few fans and potential audience members as possible. I wish I could come up with a better way to put that, but what can you do? So do keep in mind that throughout this critique, I will be speaking in a very broad and general sense. I don't expect everyone to agree with all or even most of what I say here. I only wish to explain why a sizable portion of fans were put off by this ending, to help you understand why so many players, myself included, believe its changes negatively impact the overall experience, and why the execution of said changes leaves us doubtful about the series' future. I realize that what I'm essentially arguing with this video is that there might exist a significant number of players out there who are no longer interested in remakes specifically due to this ending, and I know full well that such an argument will be difficult to substantiate and impossible to prove. It won't be until Rebirth comes out and we finally get a look at its sales figures that my points here will be vindicated or not. I also acknowledge that I am not an industry analyst nor an authority on media criticism, so take what I say with a grain of salt. But still, I want this series to be good. I really do, and the only way that can happen is if we make our voices heard. Though, considering how late I am to the party on this, it's probable that nothing I mention here will be anything Square hasn't heard about already, in which case I'm only making this video for myself and maybe one or two other people. Honestly, even while editing this, I feel like I'm beating a dead horse, or at the very least reopening an enormous can of worms. But hey, if just one person appreciates what I have to offer, it'll be worth it. Thus, without further ado, here are my thoughts on FF7 Remake, and how its story changes could potentially hinder this series for the future. This is When Endings Break Stories, a critique of FF7R. Like I said, I am no veteran to this series. I only got into Final Fantasy less than 10 years ago when I stumbled across a scene from Advent Children on YouTube. I recall being so impressed by it, and the brunette in the video was love at first sight for a 15-year-old me, that I immediately set out to watch the film myself. However, the plot was just so confusing that I could not understand a damn thing that anyone was saying, no matter how much backstory I read up on. Thus, I came to the conclusion that I was going to have to play through the original game first. And so I did. I picked it up one day during a Steam sale, and it has since become one of my favorite games of all time. And so naturally, just like everyone else within the fan base, I was ecstatic when the remake was finally announced at E3 2015. Sure, everything went quiet after the PSX trailer, but that long period of silence allowed me to finally get caught up on a whole bunch of other Square Enix classics, and despite all my criticisms of the ending, I can still say with confidence that Remake is by far one of the best gaming experiences that I've had in recent memory. Seriously, it's up there with Resident Evil 2 Remake. That's how much I enjoyed it. The point is, I love Final Fantasy, even though I am neither a fresh newcomer nor a series veteran. Thus, while I am obviously biased against Remake's change in direction, I still feel that I'm able to offer, if maybe not the most nuanced or even neutral perspective on the game, then at least one which is neither blinded by nostalgia nor immediately receptive towards anything new, regardless of how it treats the legacy of its source material. And the reason I say that is because the problem with Remake isn't that the game is different from the original. The real question is whether the changes made in Remake were changes made for the better or changes made for the worse. In fact, let's dial it back a little bit. Before this game was even announced, fans had spent years debating whether or not a remake of Final Fantasy VII was a good or even viable idea. The original game is nearly 25 years old as of the time of recording this, and it would not be unfair to say that some of its features have not aged very well. Now, that's not to say that it's bad or anything. Hell, it's aged a heck of a lot better than the likes of Shenmue, Deus Ex, or Splinter Cell, but the polygonal Lego-shaped characters do clash rather jarringly with the pre-rendered cutscenes and hand-painted backgrounds. Likewise, turn-based combat, while still being around and retaining a very passionate fan base, is simply nowhere near as popular or even approachable to potential newcomers as it was back in the 90s. Plus, there are quite a few story elements that probably wouldn't fly over as well in today's social climate. all of these factors naturally led to much controversy within the fanbase over how Square Enix even could go about remaking the game for a modern age. On the one hand, if they were to change the story and gameplay so as to make it more accessible to newcomers, then they would risk alienating some of the more hardcore fans who grew up with this game back in the 90s. But on the other hand, if all they did was remake it in the exact same way, only with better graphics and voice acting, then the novelty would wear off quickly and it wouldn't impress us as much. Not that a remake was ever going to blow anyone's minds in the same way that the original did back in the day, but is it not worth making some sort of effort at the very least? This kind of argument almost always shows up whenever people start debating adaptations of different works of media, but the important thing to realize is that changes are not an inherently bad thing, nor are they an inherently good thing. Changes are only good or bad depending on a wide range of contextual factors, and that includes time. The games industry and the Final Fantasy series as a whole have both evolved so quickly and so significantly with time that games from just 2 decades ago now have very little in common with games which are being made nowadays. And so naturally, adjustments need to be made in order to meet the changing interests of the industry's player base. This is why I think the whole remake, remaster, reboot, reimagining argument that we keep running into online is just so misguided. Because again, the question isn't whether or not changes should be made in the first place. They absolutely should. The real issue is knowing which ones are good and which ones are bad. It doesn't matter if what you're making is a sequel, a remake, a reboot, or an adaptation of any sort. The old doing something different rebuttal does not justify doing something that's worse. When adapting from an established IP, your goal should always be to provide an experience which is just as good as, if not better than what had already been offered.
It's about this time, if they haven't already, that people will start claiming that the original story was convoluted trash to begin with, so who cares? I don't agree that the original story was trash, but I can absolutely admit that it had its problems. However, it was almost perfectly paced and very well executed as a whole. It managed to make millions of people care about little blocks moving around on the screen. And just because it wasn't Shakespeare shouldn't be licensed to make it worse. A good remake should fix plot holes, not make literally infinite more.
Now, it is worth mentioning, of course, that you're never going to satisfy 100% of your audience. That is genuinely impossible. There is always going to be a subset of people out there who will wind up disappointed in the end. But the ideal, one would think, is to keep that number as small as you possibly can, because the larger it gets, the more that raises the question, why even use an established intellectual property to begin with? I mean, when you're working off of an established IP, then obviously your hope is that the existing fan base will be there to support you financially. But fans come with expectations, and if you're not going to make something which is up to the standard they've come to expect, then what's the point of using brand recognition? Why not just build an entirely new IP from scratch? Why even use an established property if you're just going to upset thousands, if not millions, of people who already recognize it? Now, some might try and argue that fans are just entitled or impossible to please, and so fuck them, their opinions aren't worth considering, yada yada. But one, what some call entitled, others might call just having different standards when it comes to storytelling. And two, if you want the perks of brand recognition and people being excited for what comes next, then you're going to have to deal with fan expectations regardless of whether you want to or not. Yes, even if you were the one who created it.
People are pointing out, Metal Gear Solid 2 and other games where some people liked it, some people thought it was divisive. Those are all good examples, but I really think that this is a little bit different because we know Final Fantasy VII is a known quantity. So when you're not giving us what you promised, we know what what's not there. If this was a brand new story and they did that, I think I would be okay. But instead of being excited, I as a fan felt disappointed. And I don't think that's the expectation they wanted. So to me, that was just a crap execution.
Now, that doesn't mean you have to retread every plot beat or story idea that audiences have seen already, nor should you start pandering to fans' every little request. I mean, just because fans are passionate doesn't mean they understand how good fiction works, and cheap fan service is a frequent cause of death or stagnation for once great franchises. What it does mean, however, is that no matter what you do and no matter what creative risks you take, you still need to tell a good story. You still have to create an immersive experience which will satisfy viewers and does not feel at odds with either itself nor the franchise to which it belongs. I'm all in favor of taking risks, exploring new ideas in order to keep a franchise from going stale. I welcome it, in fact. Doing something different and kindling your fan base from time to time is essential to creating good fiction. The only thing you cannot do, however, under any circumstances, is instill apathy in the viewer. You must never cause vast numbers of fans and audience members to lose all emotional investment in your creation. Merely upsetting your audience is one thing. After all, anger and devastation are just two more emotions which writers can evoke to make viewers feel invested. Apathy, however, is the complete lack of investment. As such, it is a death sentence when it comes to how viewers engage with your art. Nothing you do, none of your efforts, none of the bold risks you take, nothing matters if the audience just doesn't care about anything that happens in your work. No, you shouldn't just give the most hardcore fans exactly what they ask for, and yes, creators must experiment with new things to prevent a franchise going stale. However, they must also not forget the key elements and concepts which made that franchise so beloved in the first place. Because trying to profit off of an existing brand without having to give a shit about the same people who love and support that brand, that's just trying to have your cake and eat it too.
They made it so they could do whatever they want to in the next chapter, without the fans telling them that they can't. And I don't trust them to deliver a better story at all. I wanted them to expand the lore of the original, new characters, new journeys, some changes, sure. Now I understand completely that fans shouldn't be entitled to certain things. That's fair. But creators aren't entitled to say that old story sucks and my new vision is way better than what worked before. And my new vision should be viewed as a genius masterpiece. Also, I'm going to bank on your nostalgia so I can call my failures a success.
Being relatively new to Final Fantasy myself, I don't mind the fact that the series is now different from what it used to be. I've never played a JRPG specifically for the turn-based combat or the pre-rendered backgrounds. I play them for the stories. I very much prefer the storytelling of 90s-era Squaresoft to anything found in Final Fantasy XII or XIII, but the graphics whore in me also likes the more photorealistic visuals and action-oriented combat that Square has been working towards these past several years. And that's why I never wanted nor expected Remake to be a one-to-one recreation of the original, or even a complete overhaul for that matter. What I wanted was an adaptation of the original game's plot and themes with additional story content, deeper characterization, a more action-packed yet strategically oriented combat system, and an Advent Children type art style. That way, ideally, you'd have the best of both worlds. And you know what? I believe Remake was for the most part successful in this regard. While there were some serious deviations which I was not so fond of, and which I'll be talking about in great detail later, the game also expands and in many respects improves upon the original in ways which, I think, made for an incredible experience overall. Now granted, there were a few hiccups here and there. The padding got rather excessive now and then, the map designs were too narrow, the side quests were nothing to write home about, the Hell House was an unbalanced nightmare to go up against, at least some of the Sector 7 NPCs should have died in the plate collapse, rather than every single one of them surviving. Some of the attempts at humor fall a little flat, Cat Shee's cameo came at the most inopportune moment.
You maniac! You blew it up! Damn you! God damn you all to hell!
Barrett's death fake-out was pretty lame, Leslie's subplot rang hollow and unsympathetic, Kyrie was annoying as shit, and it really does suck that they had to alter the whole Trail of Blood sequence not just due to age rating concerns, but also to include a new dungeon so that players could level up Aerith again before the final boss rush. However, despite all of these complaints, I enjoyed my time with Remake. Barring a few minor quibbles, I absolutely love the combat, which really helps to make those long instances of padding far less unbearable to me, which is more than I can say about Final Fantasy XIII or its predecessor. I also love most of the mini-games, the soundtrack, the boss fights.
It's your turn. Let me handle this. Let's do this.
And I especially love how the characters are even more fleshed out than they were in the original game. I can't cover everything here, but there are just so many standout moments, such as Aerith taking out one of Corneo's goons with a folding chair, or this later scene in the train graveyard wherein we learn that she has a deep fear of being abandoned. There's Cloud and Tifa awkwardly flirting with each other before later mourning the loss of their homes and loved ones, all while she repeatedly tries to shoulder blame for that which is clearly not her own fault, to say nothing of nearly every scene between Barrett and his daughter. And who could forget about all that snarky banter between the party members during combat?
Come on, you see the piece of shit we got in here?
Says the 300-pound sack of it.
Hey!
Focus!
I'm a sucker for fine details and other similar elements that make a game world feel alive, and Remake absolutely excels in this regard. There's the part where you meet Jessie's parents up on the Sector 7 plate, or the room in which Aerith and her mother stayed during captivity. There's the whole VR sequence in the tower, the new subplot in which Shinra is now set on expanding into Wutai, where Corneo hopes to build a new hive for himself, to say nothing of the whole wall market sequence, which somehow manages to be even more over the top and goofy than it was in the original game. How about all the new and re-envisioned enemies that you face throughout your journey, or the new side characters whom you befriend along the way? The attention to detail in this game is nothing short of impeccable, like the drink that Tifa serves Cloud, which just so happens to be the exact same color as her eyes, or the fact that Abzu will dive back into water once you set it ablaze. It helps immensely that the graphics and character models in Remake are gorgeous, the NPCs and matte paintings notwithstanding. It nails the dark and oppressive atmosphere of Midgar, not just with its stunning visuals, but also with its amazing soundtrack, which sets the tone of every scene perfectly, like the use of French horns and high-pitched violins to create a sense of danger and urgency when you're off to rescue Aerith.
You're mine.
Intruders! Get up!
It's these things, all these elements which help draw you into the narrative and better empathize with the heroes that remind me of why I love the original game so much, and I am thoroughly relieved that both the devs and the localizers managed to recapture so much of what we all love and adore about this world and its characters. The dialogue, barring a few exceptions, is masterfully translated, and it's all backed by some excellent voice performances which fit the characters to a T.
You son of a bitch! What have you
done? Okay. For the most part. I'll admit that there is the odd line which could have had better delivery, but the point still stands.
I'm gonna be a soldier. The best of the best. Like Sephiroth.
The Great War hero, huh? Isn't it pretty hard to become a soldier?
Yeah. So I won't be back for a long time.
Sorry, I'm Barrett. Marlene's my little girl. Marlene, she's got short hair. She's cute as a button, with the heart of an angel. She was wearing, pink. She was wearing a pink dress today.
Upstairs.
So, Cloud, you were a soldier first class, right?
Yeah.
Weird.
Really? What's weird about it?
Nothing. Just that you were the same rank.
Huh? As who?
The first guy I ever loved.
I tried to keep it alive as long as I could. But now, it's dead and buried. Like the bar, our home, and everything else.
There is just so much love and care put into nearly every aspect of this game that it's almost impossible to not get drawn in as soon as you boot it up. But like I said, when you're adapting a story or otherwise working off of an established IP, any changes you make should always be for the better. And if that is not the case, if the changes being made are for the worse, then you should either make it an entirely new work with its own story and characters, or just don't do it. And so with that in mind, I would now like to talk about the ending, because Remake's ending, depending on how future installments play out, could easily wind up being a change made for the absolute worst. My initial reaction upon completing Chapter 18 was one of outrage. I am not at all exaggerating when I say that this game literally sent me through the 5 stages of grief. First, I was in denial about what I had just seen, but then I became really angry at the writers for, open quotes, ruining one of the best video game stories of all time. After that, I started signing petitions and answering polls in the hopes that Square Enix would try to fix the ending with DLC, aka bargaining, before then falling into a days-long depression which had me in doubt that I would even bother playing another Final Fantasy game ever again. Now, I have finally come to accept the ending for what it is, but only begrudgingly so. Again, I was fine with most of the changes made to the story up until this point, and to tell you the truth, I was completely fine with the whispers that kept showing up. I had just assumed that they were mere puppets of both Jenova and Sephiroth, that they were trying to railroad our heroes along a specific path so that the antagonists could enact their plans to destroy the world. Boy, was I ever naive. But in my defense, they did release this image of Sephiroth surrounded by whispers before the game came out, so I guess you can blame their marketing department for that. Either way, you can imagine how frustrated I was when I reached the last 2 chapters and found out that this was not the case. To sum it all up, Remake pulls a huge meta-twist on the player's expectations by revealing that the entire game is not just, strictly speaking, a remake of the original, but also a sequel set in an altered timeline. Yep, you heard that right. We're bringing time travel into this story, bitch. Well, sort of. You see, Remake starts off in pretty much the exact same way that the original game did, only with Sephiroth now appearing much earlier in the narrative, and then at the end of the game, it's revealed that he now has knowledge of the future, that is, the events of the original game's continuity, and so what he is doing essentially is going around and screwing with the timeline in order to change the future, and thus avert his defeat, which we all saw at the climax of the original game. Aerith, likewise, is implied to be aware of her impending death at the hands of Jenova/Sephiroth, and so she too is trying to alter the course of history, future history, so that she doesn't have to die and our heroes can instead find some other means of defeating him. In other words, they are all trying to prevent the plot of Remake from transpiring in the same way as it did in the original FF7. And those whisper things that you keep running into? It turns out that they were neither puppets of Jenova nor Sephiroth, but rather arbiters of fate. Time police whose sole purpose is to preserve the original timeline and thus prevent Remake's plot from diverging too heavily from that of the original game. Until that is, the final chapter, in which Sephiroth essentially tricks the protagonists into destroying the Whispers so that, unbeknownst to them, both he and Jenova can go about their plan of destroying the world unimpeded. This in turn frees the plot of Remake from the original game's continuity, thereby implying that future installments will presumably go off the rails and not even bother adhering to the original game's story at all. Oh yeah, and Biggs, Wedge, and possibly even Jesse all survived, along with Zack, who appears to be alive in what we can only assume to be either this new timeline that our heroes have created, or even a parallel universe somewhere. What the bratwurst? Basically, what this ending seems to imply is that the remake in the title has a second meaning, in that the characters themselves are actively remaking the timeline in which the original game's story took place. Now, exactly how far the writers end up going with these changes remains to be seen, as future installments are still very much underway. In fact, there's been some debate as to whether this whole sequel theory is even true or not, as many believe this could all just be part of Square's overly elaborate ploy to keep fans guessing, and that future installments might just ignore these alternate timeline theories and other possible misdirects. And you know, I'm sure it'd be nice to believe that, but it seems unlikely to me given that things have already been altered beyond repair, and there have been some pretty well thought out and educated guesses as to where all of this could lead going forward.
The next 20 or so hours of the original game are spent slowly travelling around the world in pursuit of Sephiroth, whose legend and presence are built up bit by bit. But now this can't happen. The stakes have effectively already been shattered with us defeating Destiny itself and having an epic showdown with Sephiroth in an alternative dimension. So being faithful and using the same setup of a slow pursuit with gradual build-up can't really work anymore.
One of the more common fan theories surrounding this ending is that the Sephiroth whom we encounter in Remake might in fact be the same one from after the events of Advent Children, having somehow gained the ability to time travel or at the very least communicate with his past self, his goal in either case being to remake the course of history, future history, so that he can finally win while our heroes lose. Now, this theory remains unconfirmed as yet, but believe me, it is possible. It's no secret by now that the writers at Square are absolutely obsessed with fate, time travel, and multiverse theory in general. They've been shoehorning these concepts into nearly everything that they make, and I am now praying desperately that Remake's protagonists will never actually use time travel at any point, because there are just far too many ways in which that could go wrong, especially in the hands of these developers. Sorry for the interruption, but this bears mentioning given the images that I just showed. Already I can see people commenting on how Nomura didn't write the story and that it was actually Motomo Toriyama and Kazushika Nojima's doing. But that is ultimately a distinction without a difference because writer and director are not mutually exclusive positions. Game development is, after all, a collaborative effort between everyone involved, and the lines which separate each person's role from the next are not as stringent as people make them out to be. Ultimately, though, what it all comes down to is simply a matter of who has authority over whom. And 9 times out of 10, it is the director who has authority over the writer, not the other way around. Nomura and Nojima both agreed to Remake's story changes right from the early planning phase, something which Nojima would have had to go along with anyway because he and Toriyama are subordinate to Nomura's direction. The only person who has actual creative authority over the director is the producer, Yoshinori Kitase. And while it's true that Kitase did wish for the story to be even more drastically altered, he didn't make many requests of the dev team either. He seemingly just allowed these guys to do whatever they felt like. Now, yes, Nomura did state that he wanted Remake to be as faithful to the original game as possible, but all that seems to imply is that he doesn't think that time-traveling phantoms, characters returning from the dead, or a premature fight with Sephiroth are at all out of place in FF7. And if that's true, then frankly, their talk of being faithful to the OG is meaningless in my opinion. The point is, regardless of the roles with which they were credited, Remake's story changes were a collaborative decision between all of these men, so arguing over who was the one putting actual words to paper is really just a pointless waste of time.
What I see very quickly and very defensively brought up during 7 Remake discourse is this interview where producer Kitase says that he originally envisioned this remake being a lot different, but it was actually Nomura who said, let's back off on some of these ideas. What this has been interpreted as is, Tetsuya Nomura had absolutely no bearing on any of these changes in Final Fantasy VII Remake at all. It was all Yoshinori Kitase's idea. Even though this very interview says that Nomura is allowed to veto Kitase's ideas. And none of those specific ideas were even mentioned here. And other interviews corroborate the fact that Nomura had plenty of creative control.
Okay, so we clear on that? Great. Now let's get back to business. Post Chrono Trigger, Square Enix efforts to include time travel in their games have been disastrous to say the very least. Final Fantasy X, Chrono Cross, Star Ocean The Last Hope, Final Fantasy XIII 2, The Third Birthday, and Kingdom Hearts Dream Drop Distance were all criticized for their incoherent time travel plots, and I can see Remake easily ending up in the exact same position if the writers actually do decide to go along with it. Let us not forget that this game being a kind of sequel that tells roughly the same story as the original, and over multiple installments no less, was also the same formula used by Final Fantasy IV The After Years, and Mortal Kombat 9 and J.J. Abrams' Star Trek reboot, which is not a good sign no matter which way you look at it, but I digress. Perhaps the writers at Square just find the concept of time travel inherently interesting and see lots of creative potential in it. Maybe they're trying to recapture the success of Chrono Trigger or even the very first Final Fantasy game back from when they were still making RPGs which were, good. Maybe they saw the direction in which anime and comic book movies were going and thought, hey, let's do that. I've seen a lot of Evangelion Rebuild comparisons, so who knows. Perhaps they're just trying to resolve all the dangling plot threads and other dubious retcons for which the spin-off titles are now infamous. I mean, for example, Sephiroth's revival at the climax of Advent Children angered a lot of fans for outright invalidating the game's conclusion, so it's possible they're just trying to resolve that problem by rewriting the timeline in such a way that our protagonist can finally defeat Sephiroth for good at the Northern Crater, as per the original game before the compilation came along. It's a theory which is strengthened by the numerous and seemingly contradictory interviews wherein director Tetsuya Nomura states that he both does and doesn't want certain elements from the compilation to appear in Remake, but even that explanation seems rather superfluous when one considers just how easily they could have written off the compilation as not canon. Really, if we're being honest, I think the most plausible explanation is that the devs didn't want Remake to serve as a replacement for the original. Nomura has already admitted to this in an interview, but just think about it. Final Fantasy VII is one of the most beloved and influential video games of all time, and so it makes sense that these same people who worked on it would not wish to replace the original or in any way supplant its legacy by just adapting/remaking it for contemporary audiences. Kind of ironic when you consider how the game ends with our heroes essentially erasing the original game's timeline to create a new one. But by having Remake be a sort of sequel that takes place in an altered timeline, the game is perhaps able to function as an at least semi-faithful retelling of the original without also serving as a direct replacement for it. Come to think of it, this might have been what they meant in the Ultimania book when they said that the plots of forthcoming installments would still be adhering more or less faithfully to that of the original game. However, I am in no way inclined to take such statements at face value, and these two later interviews seem to imply that there probably will be some rather significant changes going forward, so they could just be lying for all we know. It's also worth mentioning that many of the interviews wherein the devs talk about wanting to remain faithful to the OG are worded in a manner which allows lots of room for interpretation. For example, the aforementioned interview wherein Kitase states that the story of FF7 will continue as FF7 always has was mistranslated. What he really says in Japanese goes more along the lines of, even given the remake version, please assume that FF7 will remain FF7. He makes no mention of the story specifically, which thus raises the question, what is FF7 in the minds of its creators? Are they even talking about the remake sequel trilogy, or are they just saying that the original game will be left as is? See, all that these interviews confirm is that the devs have their own conception of what the word faithful means, and whatever that conception is, I can tell you straight away that it is quite different from what a lot of fans would recognize as such, because being faithful is a subjective metric which varies from person to person. The devs can talk all they want about preserving the crux of FF7, whatever that's supposed to mean, but ultimately, it is the individual players who will each be their own judge as to whether this series is, open quotes, faithful or not, regardless of developers' intentions. There's a difference, after all, between what an artist says and what audiences are prepared to accept. Besides, given what they've managed to pull off with Part 1 already, it's hard to trust anything coming out of these guys' mouths, to be honest. But whatever their motivations for including alternate timeline tropes may be, it doesn't change the fact that there are still many potential problems with it, some so serious in fact that they could even end up ruining the entire remake subseries. And thus, it falls upon me to explain why the writers at Square are just so god-awful at telling time travel stories. I already wrote an entirely separate essay on this that even got featured on the State of the Arc podcast, so feel free to check that out if it interests you. Or maybe don't, it's pretty outdated at this point, but a lot of what I'll be saying here is also adapted from there, so the choice is yours. In any case, it is now clear that somebody needs to stop these people from forcing more poorly written time travel shenanigans into their games before something terrible happens to the world. So here it goes. In the entire landscape of fiction, the best stories which involve time travel are not about time travel, per se. Take Back to the Future, for example. The first Back to the Future movie is not about time travel. It is the story of a teenage boy who gets lost in a setting which is completely alien to him and desperately wants to get back home. But he only has one opportunity to do so, as well as get his parents back together so that he doesn't cease to exist. Sure, the movie has time travel in it, but that's just a plot device upon which the real story is built. The only reason time travel exists in the movie is to set the stakes, to put Marty in a predicament wherein he has limited time and limited means by which to solve a given problem. The actual time travel logistics, meanwhile, don't make a whole lot of sense upon closer inspection. Like, why is there a delay in the ripple effects? Why don't Marty's parents recognize him from 30 years prior? But none of that matters because the movie is just so well made and riveting that we, the audience, are willing to ignore minor plot holes like that. To put it simply, the film does not bait viewers into asking questions which the writers themselves do not know the answers to. Another example, Chrono Trigger. Chrono Trigger is not about time travel. It is a story of a bunch of young people on a quest to save both themselves and their world from destruction. And aside from a few basic rules which are only briefly mentioned here or there, the game doesn't really bother trying to explain how the time travel itself makes any kind of sense. Hell, it even flat out contradicts itself at certain points, like when Marl nearly paradoxes herself out of existence. However, moments like this were easy to overlook because they were few and far between and never seriously impacted the plot in any way. It was only when Chrono Cross came along and started drawing attention to these issues that everything began falling apart. Yeah, I don't care what anyone says, the whole concept of timeline convergence will never make sense to me at all.
It's almost like don't explain how time travel works necessarily.
Yeah.
Because people are going to figure out, well, it could have worked here, it could have worked here, it could have worked here. Just have it be a thing that happens because of some mysterious crystal that you got, and that's that.
Yeah, or if you do explain it, have it with some very basic rules, and only very few. In Chrono Trigger's case, one of the reasons why Chrono Trigger works is because of the concept of time traveler's immunity, right? It's a rule. That means that if I go back and change something in the past, it cannot change my previous experience that led to my birth. Or whatever,
rule,
right? Which is why the moment where Luca describes the grandfather paradox does not belong in Chrono Trigger because
it doesn't make sense.
It goes against the rules.
Yeah, it goes against their own rules,
So that's the one part of Chrono Trigger that feels totally out of place because she's explaining this rule that doesn't actually apply to Chrono Trigger's time travel concept.
But does that matter? No, not really, because again, the only reason time travel exists in Chrono Trigger is to set the stakes, to put the characters in varying predicaments so that we can really feel that sense of adventure ourselves. The same goes for Avengers Endgame or even the first two Terminator movies. These films work because they are about characters who are just trying to survive and in doing so guarantee a future for humanity, all while being pursued by either a near indestructible killer robot or an almost invincible Tom Malthus fanatic. The actual time travel logistics, meanwhile, do not take center stage, and in Terminator's case, the two films contradict each other. The Terminator ends by implying that the future is the inevitable result of an infinite causal loop. That is, that Kyle Reese is in fact John Connor's father, and that the future war with the machines is a prerequisite for Kyle being sent back through time so that John can be born. Terminator 2, however, ultimately decided that the future is not set in stone, and that the war with the machines can be prevented, even though that directly contradicts the rules which were established in the first movie. Does that make sense? No, and in fact, T2's failure to abide by the rules established by its predecessor is what more or less doomed the entire rest of the franchise after that, but people were willing to ignore it at the time because T1's approach made for a good love story, while T2's plot about saving humanity from a future war made for an excellent finale. It wasn't until the sequels came along and started drawing attention to this inconsistency that everything began going downhill.
So in the first movie, the future's set in stone. They make that very clear because of the paradox. In the second movie, it isn't. So they stop Judgment Day and prevent the whole thing from happening. Okay, fine. Then in the third movie, all of a sudden, it is set in stone, apparently.
The attack began at 6:18 p.m.
Alright, fine. So they tried to do that. It didn't work. And the moral of the movie is that the future is set in stone no matter what. But then in the fifth movie, all of it... Then it goes back to the logic of the second movie. And they're doing all the same shit they did in the second movie. And we know none of it's gonna fucking work because the series already told us that the future's set in stone no matter what we do.
This is the beauty about a film that involves time travel, is you can actually go back and change the entire premise.
Events, yeah. You can, so long as you have, rules that make sense and that you stay within those rules.
But I digress. By now, many of you are probably thinking, what does this have to do with Remake? All this talk of Sephiroth being a time traveler or Zack being in a parallel universe is only speculative, so why am I dwelling on them here? And you're right about those particular points. The existence of alternate universes does remain unconfirmed thus far, as does the possibility of Sephiroth being a time traveler. However, the three Whispers whom you fight at the end of the game are stated in the Ultimania to be the souls of Sephiroth's remnants from Advent children. And not just that, but the planet itself is now omnitemporal, able to create time-traveling ghosts and even bring people back from the dead, which... oh boy, well I have a lot to say about this in part 2. But that's beside the point. So yes, while a lot does remain unknown at this point, the fact is that time travel, or at the very least timeline alteration, is very much a part of Remake's story now, and I think we'd be kidding ourselves to pretend that this won't be affecting the plots of future entries in any way. And remember, the point of this analysis isn't just to detail my personal issues with Remake's narrative, it's also to provide a warning against all the ways in which it could potentially go wrong, or hopefully be rectified in future installments. Therefore, I must explain what separates the good time travel stories from the bad ones, lest Remake risk becoming the latter instead of the former. The point is, the best stories which involve time travel do not focus on the time travel itself. Time travel is an insanely complicated theoretical concept which even real-life astrophysicists do not fully understand. For the same reason, most audiences neither have the desire nor the patience to figure out how it all makes sense. I mean, how can a viewer be expected to follow along with, much less remain invested in the narrative when they're already struggling to contextualize it all? How are they supposed to empathize with the characters and their circumstances when they're too busy asking questions such as, how can you change the past when in fact doing so would obliterate your motivation for going back in time and changing anything to begin with? How could you even know that history was changed if that's the case? How would the laws of entropy apply to something that gets caught in a never-ending time loop? How is traveling to the past even an option? Is the entire history of the universe being recorded on God's hard drive? What about time paradoxes? Logical paradoxes aren't even possible. So wouldn't the timeline always find a way to correct itself somehow, no matter what the characters do? These are all questions which good storytellers know to avoid because there's really no way to answer them satisfactorily. And this is why Back to the Future Part 2 initially garnered a more mixed response from both critics and audiences alike than the first movie did. The plot of the second film revolved just a little too heavily around the logistics of time travel itself, and thus it is sometimes criticized for feeling uneven and eventually raising more questions than it could answer. Now, granted, it's still a great movie, all things considered, and possibly even one of the best sequels of all time, but even hardcore fans will admit that the overall plot was just a little confusing.
This couldn't be more simple. When Biff gets the almanac in 1955, the alternate future he creates isn't the one in which Marty and Doc Brown ever used the time machine to travel to 2015. Therefore, 2015 Biff could also not have had brought the almanac to 1955 Biff. Therefore, the timeline in which 1955 Biff gets the almanac is also the timeline in which 1955 Biff never gets the almanac. And not just never gets. Never have, never hasn't, never hasn't.
But moving on, Final Fantasy XIII-2 committed the exact same cardinal sin, only much, much worse. Now, I could potentially write a doctorate's thesis on everything that FF13-2 does wrong, but basically all of its problems can be boiled down to 3 factors. 1, the game can't seem to decide on any one particular set of rules for how time travel works in its plot. It essentially just makes up the rules as it goes along. 2, the narrative has this obnoxious tendency to either withhold or relay information in the most cryptic ways possible, thus making things even more needlessly difficult to follow.
And then they go off to the future again in Erebor, where they run into our villain Caius and Yule.
If you change the future, you change the past.
Wow. No. That's not how it works. At all. At fucking all. That makes no sense. So Noel and Sarah go through another gate and end up in Academia. The reason the timeline is different is because Hope used the sphere thing to see the future and saw Sarah yelling at him for the foul C. Are you fucking kidding me, really? Is this supposed to be the big reveal of if you change the future, you change the past? The only way that would work is if you could see the future, but if you change the past, then you change the future too, so this fucking theory itself is a goddamn paradox.
And 3, it makes time paradoxes an integral part of its story, which players are expected to understand in order to follow the plot and characters, but time paradoxes are a concept which is quite literally impossible for the human mind to comprehend. And this is why other time travel stories like Back to the Future only ever refer to paradoxes in the abstract, as unknown, reality-destroying threats which need only be prevented, but not necessarily perceived by the audience.
Listen, this guy's chased me to the gym and they're gonna jump! Me!
Then get out of there!
No, Doc, not me! The other me! The one that's up on stage playing Johnny B. Good!
Great Scott! Your other self will miss the lightning bolt of the clock tower, you won't get back to the future, and we'll have a major paradox!
Wait, a paradox? You mean one of those things that can destroy the universe?
Precisely!
By contrast, FF13-2 depicts paradoxes as real, tangible phenomena that actually exist in the story's universe and which the heroes must repeatedly solve in order to continue the narrative. Let me stress that. 13-2 takes the very concept of something not making any sense at all and expects you to comprehend it in order to make sense of its narrative.
Perhaps it's not the recording that's broken. It's the immediate space-time in which we are located.
You mean it could be the paradox? Because the surrounding space-time is twisted, that might be directly affecting the device. So if the paradox is eliminated, space-time will return to normal.
Is this a future where everything has been destroyed? Or is it a distant past before the world has even come into being?
The paradox is affecting space-time itself.
In this space-time, the past and future intersect. I bet if we solve all these puzzles, we could dissolve the current paradox.
Now, add all that together, and the result is an absolute mess of causality which many viewers found impossible to understand, let alone enjoy. In trying so hard to put its own unique spin on the concept of time travel, 13-2 wound up hopelessly confusing the audience and thus damaging whatever investment they may have otherwise had in the characters and their journey. Final Fantasy games are supposed to be fun and emotional and engaging. But where is the fun or engagement in this?
I am the one who lives in all the ages. I am the one who dies in all the ages. I am the Cirrus of the oldest tribe on Pulse.
My visions of the future are recorded and stored in the Oracle Drive. A world without beginning or end. A world closed upon itself. If you change the future, you change the past. You can remold history as your heart desires.
If we succeed, if we win, we'll be changing ourselves.
If you change the future, you can change the past and correct the distortions.
But if we do, we'll be changing more than fate itself.
The timeline had been twisted before I met you. The distortion leads to a future of death and destruction.
Those born into this world, who lived and who died, will return. Are howling in pain.
This is the place where all time flows. The dreams of humanity are here washed ashore.
All these moments and memories, precious and fleeting, they're like rain rolling off his back.
He is tasked with protecting the Cirrus and remembering her visions. Now and forever, he will remember the entire timeline.
He'd tell you that he only cares about the planet, that he'd do everything in his power to protect and preserve it.
You must protect the timeline.
Sephiroth has to be stopped. He has to be.
I trust you. I believe in you.
I'm asking you to help me. I know that together we can do this.
So I will dam the river of time and tear down the foundations of history. Only then will your suffering come to an end.
Should this world be unmade, so too shall her children.
And don't even get me started on the third birthday. Ugh. The fact is, emotional, character-driven narratives and stories which fixate specifically on time travel are just not compatible. The two are mutually exclusive. I mean, unless you're some kind of alien from a distant world or whatever. But if you're human like the rest of us are, then you can either tell a riveting story with compelling characters while only using time travel as a framing device, or you can focus specifically on the time travel itself and write an overly complicated plot that tries to make sense of it all, and you'll most likely fail in the case of the latter. You cannot have it both ways, however. You just can't. If you do try and have it both ways, you are going to end up alienating a huge chunk of your potential audience because there is no quicker and more effective way of destroying their immersion than by drawing attention to all the aspects of your story that do not make sense. Pretty much all works of fiction contain various plot holes and other daft contrivances that don't make a lot of sense upon closer inspection, but good fiction writers know to avoid this problem by directing the audience's attention away from said plot holes and other minuscule shortcomings. The goal of fiction, after all, is not to be, open quotes, realistic, but believable. You want the audience to suspend their disbelief.
The suspension of disbelief is the simultaneous belief in two inconsistent things. Anyone who watches The Matrix believes both that we are watching a fight between Neo and Morpheus, but is aware that we're actually watching Keanu Reeves and Lawrence Fishburne perform a choreographed sequence of actions being shot on a film set. And it's the filmmaker's job to make it as easy on the audience as possible to suppress that second idea, which is why solid acting, writing, and editing is so important, because a discrepancy in any particular one could break the audience's immersion, destroying our investment in the story.
And to that end, here is one very specific rule by which I believe that all time travel writers should abide. Do not encourage the audience to ask questions about time travel. Maybe provide a short list of very basic and straightforward rules for how time travel can and will be used in your story, but then leave it at that. Do not try to explain in detail how it makes any kind of sense, and above all, try your absolute best to never contradict the rules which you have already laid out for yourself. If you do, then for the love of God, ignore it like it never even happened in the first place. Do not fixate on the inconsistencies in any way, or your plot will only end up devolving into an irreparably convoluted disaster, like what Terminator has become.
Why don't you use a time machine to recruit entire armies of superheroes from different timelines to counter any possible threat you could ever come up against? Why not do this every time someone dies or something goes mildly wrong? Why not go forward in time to procure advanced weapons and technology that can totally help you in the present? Why isn't there a fucking massive universal arms race for such world-shattering technology? Questions like these will simply never end because time travel is the ultimate narrative can of worms. Once you've opened it, there's no logical way to close it again, and it's only going to grow until it consumes your entire fictional universe, invalidating every plot point and destroying even the illusion of stakes and consequences.
When you start to look at all this ridiculous time travel shit, you start to realize that it doesn't make any sense. Time travel doesn't make any sense. Time travel's just there to hang a story on. We don't need a whole movie about the time travel.
And it turns into this big thing where now destiny is the enemy, fate is the enemy, and I fucking hate that kind of storytelling. It's one of my least favorite kind of storytelling in JRPGs because I don't think it's interesting. I think we live in a world where 100% of conflict comes from other people. I think that's enough. I think when you start getting into fighting fate and destiny, it stops being a story about people and it starts just being this fucking just smorgasbord of like everything is anything and anything is everything and everything is nothing because things just stop meaning anything. That's what the last like 3 hours of this game are.
That part about not breaking your own rules, by the way, is more important than one might realize. See, one of the most common retorts which you'll inevitably hear whenever someone critiques sci-fi or fantasy stories for not making any sense is that nothing in them has to make sense. Usually this goes something along the lines of, it's just magic, you can do whatever you want with magic, it doesn't have to be realistic. That is to miss the point entirely, however. Suspension of disbelief has nothing to do with some false dichotomy between realism and fantasy. No. It's about in-universe probability and consistency. See, in-universe consistency is vital to maintaining the illusion that a fictional setting is real, that it is an actual world with its own rules, peoples, and history. However, any story, regardless of premise, can still shatter that illusion if it either contradicts its own rules or otherwise expects viewers to put up with too many contrivances. So for example, if the characters in your plot are all top-tier scientists and trained combatants who should be prepared to take on any situation, then viewers aren't going to accept it when they start acting like complete imbeciles for the sake of the plot. Likewise, if the world in which your story takes place is established to have a very Christian mythology and influence, what with sacred artifacts and divine intervention and so on, then viewers aren't going to accept it when you start going the whole aliens planted the seeds of human civilization route later. See, you can get viewers to accept things that aren't realistic, absolutely, but you cannot get them to accept that which is either too contrived or downright incongruous with the plot, world, and characters with which they're already familiar.
The premise of the first work of any franchise is distinctively invulnerable to certain criticisms. It cannot contradict anything previously established because it's the very foundation for future plot points that could. When you want to tell new stories in an old universe, things can't just exist because you want them to. They revolve around the original work and everything established in it.
If the Whisperers had injected themselves into an 8 remake, one of those cherished Golden Age games I carry nostalgia for, I don't think I'd have cared so much. It's almost as though, if the original version of a game contained time paradoxes and was a vessel for general ambiguity in many places, that I would concede that there was enough there to build on. In the same way it seems that Sephiroth in Remake has rolled the dice when faced with his own defeat, one could imagine Ultimecia, just before her death, making one last attempt to disrupt this timeline rather than preserve it. And time answering with a horde of whispers. Whenever the whispers were first conceived by a writer for Remake, someone should have stepped in and said, wouldn't this work better in Final Fantasy VIII? The groundwork has already been done to support such a radical and wild storytelling decision. This is the game that could have got away with it, not the game that didn't have a hint of time manipulation. The inclusion of alternate realities and time travel to the world of Final Fantasy VII, a game famous for the overwhelming sense of loss, for the people we couldn't bring back, for its exploration of life and death, feels wrong in our blood because it's completely at odds with the theme of the original game.
Lack of realism is no excuse for this. What is impossible IRL must be an established part of your story's world in order for audiences to accept it. That, or if you are going to add something new later, then you at least need to spin it in such a way that it won't feel as contrived when it's first revealed to the audience.
Tom Riddle's diary.
It's a Horcrux, yes. 4 years ago, when you saved Ginny Weasley's life in the Chamber of Secrets, you brought me this. I knew then this was a different kind of magic. Very dark, very powerful. But until tonight, I had no idea just how powerful.
Now, yes, all stories are contrived by their very nature, since the author has to move the characters from scene A to scene B to scene C, D, E, and so on. That much is true, but the point is that stories can only retain our suspension of disbelief insofar as those contrivances feel justified, when everything that happens in them has a logical, probable, in-universe explanation. Stories break our suspension of disbelief, however, when the contrivances feel forced by the writer, when you stop empathizing with the characters and their circumstances and instead begin to see the strings on their bodies as the author puppeteers them through the plot with no regard for circumstantial probability, in-universe consistency. Things literally only happen for no adequate reason besides the writer says that they have to.
How did the characters even figure out who these Jannies are? Well, according to some cryptic commentary, Aerith somehow gained the ability to see into the future. When she touched Red 13, he gained the ability to look into the future. They couldn't figure out a way to reveal that information to the characters, so they just threw up their hands and said Aerith figured it out. Can you imagine in the Fellowship of the Ring that the real reason why Frodo split from the others is because he saw in the future that he had to? No explanation, he just saw the future and the script told him and Sam to split up.
These fate ghosts are a completely pointless plot device, since the game could have been a standalone experience without trying to force an in-universe way to legitimize changes 40 hours into changes that already exist. I don't know why this is even in here. It breaks the fourth wall, completely ruins immersion, and stands as a monumental why moment.
And this is especially a problem if said contrivance happens later in the story. That's another important point worth mentioning. You'll be given some leeway if the contrivance happens early on, typically in the first half of your story, as a means of getting the ball rolling, to set the conflict in motion. But if the contrivance happens in the second half of your story, and especially as a means of resolving conflict rather than creating it, the less likely viewers are to accept it. Or, to boil it down even further, the more time you spend in a fictional world, and the more that you're empathizing with the character's struggles, the less you want to be thinking about the writer. That's it. That's what it all comes down to, really. The more emotionally invested you are in the world, conflict, and characters, the less you will tolerate it when something happens which makes you notice the hand of the author. And so events which happen later in a story, at the height of your emotional investment, are at far greater risk of breaking your immersion than events which happen earlier in the story.
You've probably seen a lot of stories where the characters in the first third of the story get into desperate situation, there is no way out of it, and then out of nowhere someone comes and saves them. Why is this done? Usually to introduce this new character. We want to have a dramatic introduction to this character. We will have them save the other characters and show off their cool abilities. Introducing a character in Act 1 to save the day is very different from having an unnamed character show up in Act 3 to save you at the end. Han works because it's foreshadowed, but Han, if he showed up in the first third of the story, could just show up and save them and be like, oh yeah, this is my friend Han. Now you know how cool he is.
This is also why plot twists need good foreshadowing in order to function, and why so many fail due to a lack of sufficient build-up. Plot twists, by their very nature, are massive contrivances which are revealed late and fundamentally change the overall nature of a story. As such, they run an incredibly high risk of feeling forced by the writer and thereby breaking the viewer's suspension of disbelief. Development and foreshadowing, however, if done well, subtly inform viewers that the twists were being built towards from the very beginning, that such game-changing revelations were a part of the story's universe all along, and not something which the writer forced onto the story at the last minute. Basically, the twist is the contrivance, and the build-up/foreshadowing is its in-universe justification. We just didn't see it coming because the clues were subtle and/or because red herrings were used to distract us. So ultimately, it's a matter of balance. You don't want your foreshadowing to be so obvious that the twist becomes predictable, but you also don't want it to be so minimal that the twist ends up feeling forced and underdeveloped.
A key rule of storytelling. Reusing an element that has already been established will always be more satisfying than introducing a brand new one. When you constantly introduce new ideas to your story, your audience doesn't really know what to expect. The rules of your story's world are constantly changing. They don't feel that any of the information you've given them matters because you can simply add a new idea that changes everything whenever you feel like it. This makes your story feel dissatisfying, not what we want.
In any case, the excuse that nothing has to make sense in fantasy works because it's just magic or whatever is precisely that, an excuse. Like the old God moves in mysterious ways cop-out argument, it just doesn't make for a satisfying answer. If you want viewers to remain seriously invested in your work, then the last thing you should do is start conjuring plot points out of thin air or otherwise start drawing attention to all the inconsistencies in your world. Because again, it's not about realism. It's about believability. And that rings particularly true, yet is especially difficult to pull off when and wherever time travel is involved. Remember, time travel is an outright minefield for plot holes which you cannot fully resolve. All you can do is mitigate and/or steer clear of the fallout, because focusing your work specifically on time travel is the writer's equivalent of trying to escape from quicksand. The harder you try, the faster you'll sink, and the story with you. What any and all fiction writers should want is for the audience to suspend their disbelief and just enjoy the story as is. But you cannot do that with disbelief of a near infinite scale. Which brings us to FF7 Remake. Rather than having them be a key part of the story right from the outset, Remake uses alternate timeline tropes as the basis for a plot twist, one which seeks to, open quotes, broaden our preconceived notions of what a remake can be, in addition to providing some clever meta-commentary on both the original game and its legacy. That might sound great in theory, but it fumbles in execution because the rest of the game up until that point doesn't do enough to warrant it. Why, you might ask? Well, first, there's the obvious problem in that they don't bother to explain anything about the Whispers until right near the end of the game, and so the twist feels lacking in terms of build-up. I know that the devs tried to foreshadow this by having the Whispers only appear at specific moments in the storyline, but again, this didn't work on me because I completely misinterpreted what purpose they'd be serving. And again, this pre-release image of Sephiroth surrounded by Whispers probably had a lot to do with that. I'm also aware that they tried to foreshadow this game being a sequel by having Aerith already know Barrett's name despite never once hearing it before, but that is nowhere near sufficient in my view. First of all, premonitions and characters being omniscient does not presuppose the existence of alternate universes. Second, Aerith having secret knowledge was something which the original game had already hinted at, so how is it supposed to clue me in that things would be different this time around? And lest we forget, Sephiroth being a time traveler is given basically no foreshadowing whatso-freaking-ever. Or at least, I don't think it is. I don't know. I never took anything he said seriously. 90% of his dialogue is just him trolling Cloud in a bored monotone. So can you really fault me for not paying attention? In fact, he reminds me a lot of Nemesis from the Resident Evil 3 remake. He appears too early on in the story and continues to make so many scripted appearances that he stops being scary and instead becomes irritating. Yeah, I know. Who am I to complain about bored monotones? I know it sounds like I'm just nitpicking details here, but those details are all symptoms of a much larger issue. See, Remake's core problem is that it is trying to tell a new story while also co-opting and adapting an old story, but it doesn't care that the former doesn't fit neatly into the framework of the latter. It can't care about that, in fact, because seamlessly integrating its new elements would require that the plot and world of FF7 be reconceptualized at a fundamental level. And if they had done that, then the game would lose all pretense of being an even semi-faithful retelling of the original. So instead, the game doesn't really bother trying to integrate its new elements seamlessly at all. Rather, both Sephiroth and the Whispers are just shoehorned into the story at specific moments, all while the rest of the game still acts as if it's going to be a faithful retelling, only to then drop that facade right at the last hour.
Because throughout the entire game until the end, like, the ghosts are just interfere with you once in a while. And that's it. They don't, and then you go right back to where you were. When I see it that way, it feels like this entire idea was a complete afterthought.
I like how all these terrible things happen because of the fucking shadow beings, but the characters almost always immediately drop it and go back to talking about Shinra. It's almost as if these things are completely shoehorned in.
There, the heroes inexplicably go from getting their asses beat by one dude and his pet to destroying a Fate Titan with ease. The central conflict abruptly shifts from fighting against a corrupt megacorporation to instead altering the space-time continuum, which is hardly conducive with the rest of the game's themes of environmentalism and class conflict. And above all, absolutely no groundwork had been laid hinting at even the existence of alternate universes or time travel. I said earlier that stories can only be immersive insofar as the contrivances feel justified, whereas they break our immersion when the contrivances feel forced by the writer, and if everything I've covered so far doesn't meet anyone's definition of forced, then I don't know what does.
The game turns from a character-centered narrative to a plot-centered one in the last hour. Here's what I mean. The plot for the whole game is rather slim. It's fairly simple. The depth is in the characters and how these characters change and react to their world. Again, this game up until the end is a character study through and through, and at the end, that's mostly all taken away. Mostly, it's all plot. The party are moved into this new dimension like puppets to defy fate for the story and not for any solid, well-developed character motivations. It's a massive focus shift. So while the Whispers and their plot may have been alluded to throughout the whole title, it doesn't change that this title wasn't about them and that the focus wasn't on them. So this focus shift in the last hour feels disjointed and unnatural. This element of destiny isn't introduced until the final hours, making it relatively unconnected to the rest of the plot.
All told, it feels like the ending of an entirely different game forced into one which was never built to accommodate it because, well, that's exactly what it is. It pushes suspension of disbelief almost past the breaking point because none of it feels like a logical consequence of anything else that's happened in the story that far. And so the result is that while the entire climactic boss rush is technologically impressive, I'll give it that, it's constantly undermined by the thought in the back of your head asking where any of this came from or why it is even happening in the first place. Although, I'll admit, the music is some of the best I've ever heard. Whatever, the point I'm trying to make here is that when writing a plot twist, you want your audience to say, "Whoa, how did I not see that coming?" However, for the reasons detailed above, none of Remake's foreshadowing worked on me, and so the ending did not so much blow my mind as it instead came right out of left field and consequently shattered my immersion. And that is by no means a problem which is unique to Remake. Time travel and other fantasy elements are a lot easier to accept the earlier they appear in a story, whereas plot twists involving time travel almost never work no matter where they appear. And the reason for this, as I've explained already, is because time travel inherently raises more questions than it answers, and so when you use it as the basis for a plot twist, you are essentially inviting your audience to nitpick all the minute details and other aspects of the story that do not make sense. And that flies right in the face of the advice that I gave earlier.
Wedge is meant to die when the plate falls, but he doesn't.
But then the Whispers try to kill him as the party's escaping Shinra HQ anyway. So why do they wait until then to intervene? Did the Whispers just forget about Wedge and only remember he's meant to die later on? Or do they just think Wedge is so unimportant that it's fine to let him live another day because he's too useless to change anything anyway? Really, the Whispers seem a little incompetent, which hardly matches their supposed role as manifestations of destiny.
It's calculatedly specific and abstract to the point where it doesn't make any logical sense, even in concept. Why would the severity of events matter to this hive mind of correctional time beings? Cloud has said and done a shitload of things that he did not in the original. That's technically a timeline split right there. Where are the Whispers at? Then Jessie sprains her ankle and suddenly the Whispers give each other high fives. It's a good thing the Whispers knew this would cause Barrett to hire Cloud in Jessie's place. Hey, hold up, what the hell? Jessie and Wedge went on the Maka Reactor 5 trip in the original. Why don't the Fate Ghosts give a shit about that?
I want to know something about Sephiroth. Why does he need the party to kill Destiny? Why couldn't he do it himself? Isn't he supposed to be stronger than all of them together? Why didn't Sephiroth kill Destiny himself, then go stab the party while they slept? Why can the party kill Destiny, but Sephiroth can't? And I still can't find a reason for why Destiny even fights the party. Their entire shtick is to make sure the characters follow the plot. If they kill them, they are literally doing the opposite, and they do this 3 times.
Take it from the CIA. The more you expect people to just shut up and stop asking questions, the more they'll resent you for it. What you should be doing is writing your plot in such a way as to discourage viewers from even asking those questions in the first place. The very first Final Fantasy back on the NES only managed to get away with this because the standards for video game storytelling back then were so low anyway that people were willing to accept just about anything. Hell, they could release a game in which you get your ass beat by a convicted sex offender and it would still go down in history as one of the best of its era, but in today's world of Reddit forums, YouTube comments, and social media proliferation, time travel and multiverse twists are an easy and guaranteed way to break one's suspension of disbelief, and it's especially the case here with Remake because it hardly even makes sense for the characters to be doing this. Why are they fighting the Whispers in order to, quote, save the planet from Sephiroth, end quote, when in fact the Whispers have the exact same goal in mind? I mean, the party already knows that Sephiroth wants to destroy the whole planet, and Nanaki flat out explains that the Whispers are bound to the planet's will, and it's abundantly clear that defying the Whispers is also what Sephiroth wants. So how, when, and why does the party decide that killing the Whispers is going to help them stop Sephiroth? The intent, presumably, was dramatic irony. The devs were trying to show that Sephiroth is manipulating the heroes into defying the planet's will so that he can go about his schemes unimpeded, but it doesn't work because the player doesn't know that the characters do not know that they're being duped. Why should they, in fact? It makes no sense for the heroes to hop through the portal and fight these planet-protecting Whispers when the same guy who wants to destroy the planet flat out taunted them to do so. It's not dramatic irony when the viewers and the characters both know, or for all intents and purposes should know, that what is happening is bad.
There are a lot of questions that need to be asked. How does Aerith know about the events of the future? Why does the cast just suddenly understand what Aerith is saying? And if they don't, why do they just go along with it? She's saying some pretty frightening things. I would be asking a whole lot more questions. Instead, everyone just decides it's a good idea to jump into the magical portal Sephiroth slashes into existence. Why are we even going against the will of the planet? Isn't the main struggle of the game about Sephiroth trying to destroy the planet while we save it? There are plenty of other questions to ask that have no answers, however, I think I've stressed the point enough.
I mean, yeah, the Whispers did kind of screw them over a bunch of times, and I guess the original game did have that business with the weapons and so on, but they've also proven quite helpful on occasion, and defending the planet has always been the party's key motivation. So, do they genuinely believe that the planet is not trying to preserve itself? That it wants to be destroyed by Sephiroth's meteor? Wouldn't it have made a lot more sense if this little tidbit had not even been mentioned until after the Whispers were defeated, and if Sephiroth himself had been the one to explain it? I, for one, think that would have made for an excellent cliffhanger, as well as more effectively clarified for the player that our heroes don't even realize the long-term consequences of their actions. I know that to a lot of people this might all sound like nitpicking, that I'm just scraping the bottom of the barrel, just looking for something to complain about, but I assure you, I'm not. None of these are issues which only occurred to me in retrospect. These were on my mind throughout the entire ending battle sequence. And it's a shame because the devs clearly intended for this to be a sort of epic finale and satisfying boss rush to end things on. I, however, did not find it satisfying due to this discrepancy between what the characters know and think and what I, the player, know and think. Up to this point, there had been zero indication that the characters believed fighting Destiny was their imperative. It all hinges on a single monologue from Aerith, which is cryptic to say the least, and nowhere near sufficient enough to make me sympathize with their motives. And what's really sad is that the writers could have at the very least sidestepped this issue by adding maybe a few lines of dialogue about how the planet does not have humanity's best interest at heart, or it'll destroy all life on its surface if it has to, something to that effect. But as it currently stands, the ending is a failed attempt at dramatic irony which just ends up making the characters look like idiots. It's like the ending of Final Fantasy XIII all over again. Both games feature protagonists who are trying to save their world from destruction, and yet the best way of doing that, apparently, is by playing directly into the antagonist's hands and thereby guaranteeing that the world be destroyed anyway.
Oh, and after they come back, you know what they try to do? They try to kill Orphan, which, need I remind you, will cause the destruction of Cocoon and the world. So this makes no sense. And guess what happens when they kill Orphan? Guess, it's a real shock. All the Fal'Cie die and Cocoon begins to plummet to the ground. Gee, I wish we could have seen that coming. You're all fucking morons!
If you have any other reasonable explanation for this, any plausible justification as to why the heroes fought Destiny, despite there being numerous reasons not to, please let me know in the comments. Because for right now, the only way this ending will ever make sense to me is if the party doesn't even remember what Red 13 said in the prison cell. If our heroes just somehow forgot that the Whispers were agents of the planet's will, and perhaps unwittingly assumed that they were of Sephiroth's will instead. It actually wouldn't surprise me if that's the case, because Final Fantasy XIII 2 did the exact same stupid fucking thing.
Kill me. The heart of chaos beats in my chest, a manifestation of Etro. Should this heart stop beating, the goddess will die once again. When the goddess dies, the chaos of Valhalla is unleashed. The chaos has the power to warp the timeline and destroy the past.
I don't care how many times you ask. I'm not killing you. No matter how hard you try, I'm not going to kill you.
You will kill me, Noel.
You resolved the final paradox, Kubo. And the timeline is back to how it was.
The gates are closed.
It's the end of our journey.
The heart of chaos beats in my chest, a manifestation of Etro. Should this heart stop beating, the goddess will die once again.
I killed the goddess?
When the goddess dies, the chaos of Valhalla is unleashed. The chaos has the power to warp the timeline and destroy the past.
Actually, let's talk about FF13 for a moment. Yeah, I know this video is supposed to be about Remake, but we might as well, given that Remake's co-writer and co-director, Motomo Toriyama, was also the one who helmed the entire Lightning saga. And so for those of you who haven't played Final Fantasy XIII, here's a little background. 13's plot suffered primarily from a lack of clear exposition and/or world building, which can be attributed not only to its extreme linearity and overall restrictive nature, but also to its in medias res opening, which does little to establish what is going on or what the rules for its universe even are. Imagine, for instance, if you saw the first Star Wars film, but the movie began at the moment our heroes arrived on the Death Star. you would have absolutely no idea who these characters are, what they are doing, why they're doing it, what their backstories are, what they're even talking about when they use terminology such as the Force, the Jedi, or Alderaan. You'd be so far out of the loop that it would be difficult for you to enjoy anything. FF13 has precisely this problem. The game thrusts you right into the middle of its plot without properly establishing who the characters are, what they are doing, or what they are even talking about. As soon as it starts, the cast is using terms such as fal'Cie, l'Cie, Cocoon, Pulse, Psycom, Guardian Core, Sanctum, Sieth, Nora, Anima, Bodum Vestige, and Ragnarok without ever once stopping to explain what those terms actually mean to the audience. They don't even take the time to introduce them gradually. The game just starts throwing all this terminology at you right from the get-go. And as anyone who has taken a screenwriting course will know, the more jargon you throw at an audience, the more they will just tune it all out.
The Purge was Psycom. Private Sanctum troops, not the Guardian Corps.
Okay, so in this conversation, I just want to pause it real quick, unless I forget. We're having very context-specific terms. The Lightning and Saz are talking about these things as people in that world would do so. But the problem is that the viewers watching this and is hearing all these terms they've never heard before, and is saying, fal'Cie, l'Cie, Psycom, Guardian Corps, what is going on here? It's sort of like I'll admit that for myself, I never felt this was too much of an issue for me, but for a lot of people who wrote to me this week, they said I was confused by all this terminology. I had no idea what was going on.
And this all boils down to the core problem with the characters in Final Fantasy XIII. None of them really have a backstory. We never learn who the mother of Saz's son is. We never see flashbacks of what Grand Pulse was like when Vanille and Fang lived there. We never see flashbacks of Hope's family. We never see what Lightning was like before her parents died. And really, do we know anything about Snow? Like, fucking anything? This lack of backstory makes almost all the characters totally unrelatable. Therefore, it alienates the player because there is nowhere to insert yourself or draw comparison to yourself. Instead, we have to rely on the data logs to tell us fucking anything about what's going on.
Now, if we assume that Toriyama was in charge of both games' exposition and storyboarding, then that might explain why Remake is so frequently described as being a poor entry point for newcomers. The game liberally references myriad elements from the spin-off titles, and many scenes which didn't appear until far later in the original game now appear much sooner, but with less context. And so, while the plot itself is easy enough to follow, a lot of the details are dependent on you already being a longtime fan. In particular, barely anything involving Zack, or Genova, or Sephiroth, or the Nibelheim incident are sufficiently explained in Remake. The developers either felt that it was unnecessary because they'd be explaining them in future games anyway, or they just assumed that you were already familiar with those things. The game's producer, Yoshinori Kitase, has said that their reason for having Sephiroth appear so early in the story was because, quote-unquote, everyone already knows who he is. It leads me to wonder if all the exposition in this game happened entirely by accident, that the developers weren't actually trying to explain anything, and that it only occurred by circumstance of this game being adapted from a pre-existing story. Because the devs seem to have fallen victim to the curse of knowledge and consequently failed to recognize that a lot of the people playing Remake are newcomers who remain unfamiliar with 7's universe. Kitase actually seems to believe that the original game's story is so popular and so well known at this point that even people who haven't played it already know who these characters are, how they are connected to each other, and why they are each relevant to the story at all, which just screams a false consensus on his part. Even if that's the case in Japan, where this series is one of the most popular video game franchises ever, it is most certainly not the case in Western countries where Final Fantasy is not a household name. Going back to Sephiroth, the idea that Remake doesn't have to explain anything about who he is to newcomers because pop culture and marketing will do all the exposition for these guys is not only the laziest thing I have ever seen a writer or producer admit to doing, it's woefully presumptuous and also ignorant of the fact that most newcomers probably don't know anything about Sephiroth beyond his appearance and basic status as the villain. When people ask, who is Sephiroth? They're not asking whether he's the villain or not, they're asking why he's the villain, and how he is connected to our protagonists. Two questions which the game never actually delves into. And the same can be said for the other cameos which the devs thoughtlessly forced into this game's narrative.
Zach was his name?
Zach.
What? Who is Zach? Is this... I still feel like this is some, like, alternate...
Wait, but... I'm sorry, but it's really jarring when I'm in the middle of the game's most emotional scene and they randomly cut to a bipedal cat in a towel wearing a crown.
Oh my
God. What
god.
is that?
Hey, look who it is.
What the hell is that?
You'll see.
Why is Felix the cat in this game all of a sudden?
You'll see.
Then at the very end, as you're leaving the city, a magic portal to space will appear, and you have to go through and fight Sephiroth on the moon. Any questions? Yes, several. I don't know what the fuck's going on at the end there. I feel sorry for anyone playing this game with no knowledge of the original. Blimey, my pretty anime sword boy daydreams about Gwyneth Paltrow a lot.
And 13 is far from the first time that this has happened. They did the same thing in FF12 and Advent Children too. Gee, one moment I'm talking about Remake, then FF13, and now Advent Children. I'm on a roll. Now, even overlooking the fact that AC's plot is completely impenetrable to those who haven't played the original FF7, despite Square's purported efforts to the contrary, the film has been highly contentious among FF7 fans due in no small part to its portrayal of Cloud as a depressed and apathetic loner, which many felt was antithetical to how he'd been portrayed in previous appearances. Just where else have we seen that before? Shucks, I couldn't tell you. Anyway, I'll be forthright and say that I don't think Cloud is the type of guy who would just up and abandon his family in the way he did. So, any way you slice it, I still think his portrayal in the film is mostly out of character, but there are still things which AC could have done to make his change in mood feel more plausible. Part of the discrepancy can just be chalked up to cultural differences crossed with poor localization, and the extended cut of the film did try to flesh him out further by adding more scenes of character development, wherein it's implied that the geostigma is messing with his brain. But even that didn't help very much because the film still did not give viewers a sufficient explanation as to how and why he became so moody in the first place. You see, around the same time that Advent Children was released, the film's writer Kazushika Nojima wrote and published On the Way to a Smile, which is a collection of short stories detailing what all has been happening to both our heroes and their world after the game's conclusion. Most notably for our purposes, though, Tifa's story includes one scene wherein the party meets with Elmira and Calm, and another wherein Cloud is tasked with bringing flowers to Aerith's grave in the Forgotten City. And it is these particular moments which kick off Cloud's descent into misery. Up until this point, he had been happy and adjusting well to a normal life with Tifa, but seeing Aerith's mother tearfully mourning the loss of her daughter reignites all of his childhood insecurities which he had presumably buried by the climax of the game. But with Sephiroth now gone and there not being any serious threat to the planet anymore, Cloud is left unable to ignore his emotions and thus finds himself overwhelmed internally. His survivor's guilt soon ends up straining his relationship with Tifa until one day he brings home a terminally ill boy named Denzel in the hopes of curing him, thereby atoning for his past failures. Shortly thereafter, he catches the disease himself, which screws with his mind even further and thus sends him into a near suicidal state of apathy. And so to spare everyone the heartbreak of seeing him in such an ill-fated condition, he abandons his family and goes off to live alone in Aerith's church. So, once you're finally read up on all of this backstory, Cloud's sudden change of mood begins to feel a lot less unwarranted. Now that we have context, the stage is at last set for Advent Children. The only problem is, none of this is in the fucking movie! The entire context for the story is missing from the film itself! Sorry to raise my voice like that, but I just had to hammer the point home. I cannot stress how much of a problem it is when writers forget to include context. And what makes it all so frustrating is the fact that it's such a rookie mistake. Usually, it's because the writer is just too excited to get to the good stuff, which is generally found near the middle of the story, and so they forget that nobody is on the same page as they are, and consequently fail to include all of the important exposition and build-up which is necessary for that good stuff to have any meaningful impact.
Have you ever told a story once, and nobody laughs, and you're like, you had to be there, right?
Yeah, you had to be there.
Well, what you're really saying when you say, oh, you had to be there is, oh, the character development and the many hours of time being spent with these people made it funny in a way that you wouldn't understand unless you were, unless you knew these people.
In other words, the person telling the story is a bad storyteller.
Sure, exactly.
They didn't provide the context and the character development.
You talked about
This same problem is also why so many artists and philosophers keep saying, nobody understands my work. Their heads are lodged so far up their own asses that they are unable to successfully communicate their ideas to an audience. And if the audience does not understand what you are talking about, then they'll eventually stop caring. I did when I tried playing Final Fantasy XIII only a few years back. I gave up after the 7-hour mark because I didn't have the patience for it, and the infuriatingly repetitive dialogue couldn't possibly have helped matters.
Let's see.
Fal'Cie.
Cocoon Sanctum. Psycom.
Psycom.
Pulse.
Sanctum. Pulse.
Pulse.
Psycom. Sanctum.
Psycom. Pulse Fal'Cie. Let's see. Pulse Fal'Cie. Pulse Fal'Cie. Sanctum.
Fal'Cie. Pulse Fal'Cie.
Pulse Fal'Cie and Fal'Cie. Cocoon Fal'Cie. Pulse.
Pulse. Let's see. Pulse Fal'Cie. Cocoon.
Fal'Cie. Focus the Fal'Cie.
Fal'Cie. Pulse. Fal'Cie. Fal'Cie.
Fal'Cie.
Pulse. Let's see.
Fal'Cie.
Focus. Let's see. Fal'Cie. Cocoon. Fal'Cie. Let's see. Focus. Let's see. Focus. Fal'Cie.
Fal'Cie. Cocoon.
Pulse. Let's see. Pulse. Let's see. Cocoon. Focus.
Cocoon. Focus.
Fal'Cie. Focus.
Let's see. Focus.
Fal'Cie.
Pulse. Sanctum Fal'Cie.
Pulse.
Pulse. Cocoon.
Fal'Cie.
Focus. Let's see.
Cocoon.
Fal'Cie.
Fal'Cie. Focus. Fal'Cie.
Fal'Cie.
Fal'Cie. Fal'Cie. Fal'Cie.
Let's see.
Fal'Cie. Focus.
Focus. Fal'Cie.
Focus.
Fal'Cie.
Pulse. Let's see. Cocoon. Focus. Focus. Cocoon. Let's see. Cocoon. Cocoon. Focus. Cocoon. Fal'Cie. Focus. Pulse. Fal'Cie. Cocoon. Cocoon.
Focus. Fal'Cie.
Psycom. Psycom. Pulse. Let's see.
Psycom.
Pulse. Fal'Cie. Sanctum. Sanctum's Fal'Cie.
Psycom.
Cocoon.
Focus.
Focus. Fal'Cie. Pulse.
Pulse.
Pulse. Let's see. Sanctum Fal'Cie.
Let's see.
Focus. Focus.
Let's see. Let's see. Pulse. Let's see.
Let's see.
Sanctum Cocoon Pulse.
Fal'Cie. Eden. Sanctum.
Cocoon Pulse. Sanctum's Focus.
Sanctum.
Fal'Cie.
Sanctum Fal'Cie. Cocoon. Fal'Cie.
And even if you do have the patience to figure out what is going on in 13's narrative, it doesn't change the fact that the main event which kicks everything off, Sarah being cursed by a Fal'Cie, is never actually shown on screen, even in flashbacks. Like Advent Children before it, the beginning of the story is flat out missing from the game itself. You don't have to be a screenwriter to recognize that this is bad storytelling, as it makes for a very alienating experience in which the viewers are all left struggling to contextualize anything. And the developers were clearly aware of this. Toriyama himself admits that 13's lack of backstory was intentional, as they wanted to focus more on the characters rather than spend time fleshing out the world. Hence their reason for including all of those data logs in the game's menu as a trade-off. Meanwhile, Nomura and Nojima admit to having deliberately left a lot of exposition out of Advent Children because they wanted viewers to enjoy filling in the gaps on their own. What these two failed to recognize, however, is that when it comes to storytelling, context is not something you can leave up to interpretation. Well, I mean, you can, but my point is you shouldn't. And the reason you shouldn't is because context is the number one thing which audiences depend on in order to become invested in your story. It's what enables us to not simply follow along with your plot, world, and characters, but also understand why anything they do or why anything that happens to them matters. Without that context, there's no reason for the audience to care. And this is why having too much mystery can be just as big of an issue as having too little mystery. I can understand wanting to leave certain details or even subplots up to interpretation, but there is a fine line between leaving room for fans to make up their own theories and outright forcing them to make up their own theories, all because they aren't even sure what happened in your work to begin with. The former is perfectly fine and acceptable. The latter is just leaving a trail of destruction behind you and expecting the fans to clean up after your mess. And that is not okay when you're trying to tell a story which has a huge emphasis on human emotion and drama. Drama, after all, requires a great deal of audience investment in order to be effective. But if you fail to provide audiences with enough clarity or context to remain invested, then none of those big emotional moments or dramatic payoffs which you're building towards are going to leave much of an impact on the viewer. One of the things that I dislike most in fiction is when a story gives me no reason to care other than because the writers said that I should. No, that isn't going to cut it for me. My default setting is to not care about fictional characters in fictional conflicts because the human brain was not built to empathize with a theoretically infinite number of people. If a writer wants me to enjoy their story, they have to give me good reasons to care, and context would be the best place to start.
Yeah, which real quick, there was something when I was reading the On the Way to a Smile novel. It made me want to go watch Advent Children, but I don't have the complete edition. But I think had we had that novel when Advent Children first came out, we would have had so much context to it, and I probably would have enjoyed that movie even more.
Yeah, I feel you. I actually just recently bought the complete edition, and it's decent. I think context would have made it better. I think you're right.
Oh, people say it's open to interpretation and you're supposed to discuss it on forums and stuff, but I don't buy that. It's like when you tell a joke and nobody laughs. You then explain the joke and people go, oh, that's pretty clever, I guess, but they still won't laugh because you didn't tell the joke properly in the first place.
No, the problem with this fight is, and this is especially true for a new player, is that the game hasn't given us any reason to care. At this point in the game, all we know about Sephiroth is that he's a scary-looking guy who sometimes harasses Cloud in visions. We know nothing of his history with Shinra, with Soldier, with Zack, with Tifa, and aside from one flashback of the Nibelheim incident, even with Cloud. You could play through the entirety of the remake and not understand that he's the game's primary antagonist, save for the fact that the game makes you fight him, because in the original, the cutscene that normally explains all this takes place after this fight would've, in the next village that the party encounters. There's just no motivation to fight this guy outside of that one vague Nibelheim reference.
And really, above all else, that's what I've been trying to get at with this ending. Remake's entire climactic boss rush just kinda happens without enough build-up to resonate effectively, doubly so if you're a newcomer with no prior knowledge of FF7. The Sephiroth fight in particular rings hollow on account of it being given almost no narrative justification whatsoever, likely a consequence of him not being added until later in the game's development. I suspect it's here only to cement the idea that fate has been conquered and the story can go off the rails moving forward, which seems rather superfluous given all the other changes unveiled by this ending, or the devs only included it for fan service, I guess. However, if that was their intent, then I for one did not feel served by this battle, because I had no story-based reason to feel invested in it.
Let's finish this.
Sure, the gameplay's really good, and the fight is rather stunning from a technical perspective, but style doesn't amount to much when there's no actual narrative to accompany it. I said this before, and I'll say it again, but I don't play Final Fantasy games just for the combat, or just so I can passively watch characters fumble their way through set piece after set piece like a Marvel movie. No. I play Final Fantasy games for their stories. I play them because I want to feel what the characters are feeling, to become immersed in their worlds, and to feel invested in their struggles. And when I am not invested in their struggles, when I am not immersed in their worlds, when I find that the story of a Final Fantasy game is either bad or simply non-existent, with no actual narrative reason to care about what's happening on screen, then no amount of style or gameplay can save it in my eyes.
Special effects are just a tool, a means of telling a story. People have a tendency to confuse them as an end to themselves. A special effect without a story is a pretty boring thing.
And that finally brings us to the last of my criticisms surrounding Remake. Well, for now, that is. It doesn't leave viewers with anything to root for. It doesn't so much leave us wondering what will happen next, as it instead leaves one baffled as to what happened anyway or how it even fits into 7's universe at all. I said earlier that what I loved most about Remake was how well it got me to empathize with its characters and their circumstances, but I'm not empathizing with them anymore, not after the final chapter, because aside from feeling baffled as to why they fought Destiny in the first place, there's also no clear indication as to what really matters going forward. Sephiroth's motives are barely touched on, it's unclear how much he and Aerith know about the future, and the trailer for Rebirth only adds fuel to that fire. We still don't know what Aerith did to that portal, and above all, our heroes are so prematurely overpowered that it doesn't feel like there's anything left to strive against anymore. I mean, let me just state for the record that when your game ends with the heroes proclaiming that they must stop the bad guy from destroying the whole planet...
Sephiroth. As long as he's still out there.
I'm in too! Bastard wants to destroy the whole planet, doesn't he?
My immediate response should not be, so what? No, really, that's what I said upon beating Remake. Where are we supposed to go now that we've already slain a god and even kicked Sephiroth's ass? How am I supposed to feel tension after all the ludicrously contrived means which the writers have gone to get the heroes out of unsurvivable circumstances unscathed? There have been not one, not two, but 4 death fakeouts thus far, possibly up to 7 if we count those which haven't yet been confirmed by the developers. But let's be honest, we all know damn well that Wedge, Jesse, and Sonon are coming back, and I honestly wouldn't be shocked if even President Shinra were to return later as well, but now we're getting all speculative again. The point is, the plot armor is too obvious. There doesn't seem to be any correlation between the severity of a given threat and whether a character's life is actually threatened. Not only have the writers spared over half a dozen characters from their originally scripted deaths, but the means by which they have done it are so obviously forced that it completely violates my suspension of disbelief.
You could argue the fate is defeated at the end and won't appear anymore. Now a total new story unfolds, but the fact that a power like this exists inside the story allows the writers to find whatever arbitrary reason to use it. As a result, one of the most impactful elements in storytelling, death, will always feel arbitrary. All characters except for maybe Wedge survive. And even here, we can't be 100% sure now because we do not see him die. We know the trope: if a character falls down somewhere into the abyss and we don't see the corpse, he is 100% still alive. I'm not excited to find out if he survived or not. I just find it nonsensical because his potential death or survival can't develop naturally out of the story anymore. It's now a noticeable decision by the writers forced on the story and not part of the story's universe anymore. Of course, that is always the case, that the writers decide what happens, who dies and who lives, but a good story hides the functions the writer used to form it. This is not the case here anymore.
All these fakeouts do is make clear to the viewer that no matter how dire the circumstances, even if death is all but guaranteed, the writers still won't allow any harm to befall even a single named protagonist. It's as if the developers are not only reluctant to kill anyone off, but also unwilling to let audiences think they might kill anyone off. And when a writer so obviously and persistently demonstrates that they are unwilling to kill characters, even those whom we'd all expect to be dead by now, it eliminates all pretense of danger and thus dulls the drama of any new scenario which the heroes might find themselves in. Okay, sorry for yet another interruption, but in editing this, I realized that there's one more important thing that I need to mention, and it would probably be easier for me to explain it in this manner, rather than trying to, write it out in the script and then record it and add footage over top in editing. So, I've already talked about Barrett's death fakeout and how it basically ruins the story going forward, because even with the Whispers being gone, let's leave the Whispers out of the equation altogether. Even with them being gone, if Lifestream magic can resurrect the dead, as we see them do with Barrett, then that raises the question, where is all the resurrect materia? Why couldn't every character who died in the original game just be brought back afterwards? Why should I believe that any future character deaths will be permanent now? And I know that the apologetic response to that, the first thing that I'm sure a lot of commenters will say is, well, maybe Barrett didn't actually die. Maybe he was just incapacitated or KO'd, like in combat. And then maybe the Whispers just came in and used revive or cure magic on him. That's the apologetic response. And Motomo Toriyama seems to imply it in this interview right here. Let me just pull it up Barrett is pretty tough, so he might well have recovered by himself, even if the Whispers did not move to protect him. So, right there, Toriyama does seem to be implying that Barrett was never actually killed, that he was just incapacitated by Sephiroth, and that he would have recovered regardless, given enough time, and the Whispers just accelerated his recovery with either revive or cure magic. That may be the official explanation that the developers are going for, but the problem with that is that's not what is communicated through the present. Actually, let me just pull up the scene right here. So the Whispers block Barrett from killing Sephiroth, but Sephiroth can bypass the Whispers. He stabs Barrett. It goes into dramatic slow motion. That's important. Everyone freaks out and is horrified. And there's the dramatic heartbeat sound effect that you hear in the background. I mean, that's cinematic language for a character being close to death or dying, basically. And when he falls to the ground, he doesn't, like, kneel over like when KO'd. No, he falls flat on his back, fully unconscious, and the Whispers jump in to heal him. And now Barrett suddenly comes back, and Cloud stops. Everyone is completely shocked.
This death was not the one ordained for you by fate.
And Red 13 says, this death was not the one ordained for you by fate. So, even if you buy the argument that Barrett didn't actually die, he was just incapacitated and he would have recovered later even without the Whisper's intervention, everything about the way that this scene is written and directed and edited is clearly intended to signify, no, he was 100% killed and the Whispers brought him back. The way I see it, there's 3 possible explanations. If you have any better explanations, please let me know in the comments. But right now, my guess is 1, Barrett did actually die, and the Whispers did bring him back to life, and this is something that will become important in Part 3 and Rebirth. But given how poorly the Whispers are handled in this game, like the number of plot holes and inconsistencies they create, I highly doubt that the developers put that much thought into this scene. Which brings me to the second possibility. This whole sequence was just a poorly thought out excuse to not have a 4th playable party member in the Genova Dreamweaver battle. Or, and here's the third possibility, maybe Barrett didn't actually die. Maybe he really was just incapacitated and, you know, Lifestream magic actually can't resurrect the dead. And whoever was responsible for editing this scene just wasn't thinking about what they were doing or what kind of long-term impression this scene would leave on the player. Either way, it totally strips the series of any actual tension or drama moving forward, because even if any characters do die in the future, their deaths will always be overshadowed by the question of whether or not Lifestream magic can resurrect the dead or not. Holy God. Remake fans often say that the story is more intense since we don't know what's going to happen moving forward, but if you ask me, things are only less intense now that the power scaling is broken and the plot armor is off the freaking charts. See, stories aren't made intense solely by your not knowing what happens in them, they're made tense primarily by how well you're empathizing with the character's desperation, by trapping the heroes in tight circumstances wherein they have only limited time and limited means by which to overcome a certain dilemma. Let's use the Alien franchise as an example. These are some of the most intense sci-fi flicks in the entire history of cinema, and the reason for that is not just because we love these characters and want them to survive, but also because they are repeatedly thrust into life or death situations wherein they have a limited means to defeat an evil monster which could devour them in an instant. The first film has only 1 alien up against a crew of 5 to 7 people, but it's a near indestructible killing machine with concentrated acid for blood, meaning that they cannot kill it with conventional weaponry lest its remains eat through the hull of their ship. The only way they can defeat it is by blasting it into space. Alien 3, meanwhile, is set on a prison planet with no weapons, and so the prisoners can only defeat the monster by trapping and drowning it in molten lead. This, of course, leads to a prolonged chase sequence wherein they have to lure the creature into the mold using themselves as live bait. And of course, Aliens sees a 20-man one-man squad of Marines going up against an entire army of Xenos with guns and explosives, but they can't actually use any of those weapons because the whole station will go up in flames if they do. And to top it all off, the aliens are repeatedly shown to have the home field advantage because they can climb through air ducts and kill anyone by simply catching them off guard. Time and time and time again, these characters are placed in urgent circumstances wherein they have limited time and limited means by which to resolve a given conflict. The actual scale of the conflict is irrelevant. What is relevant is how much we care about the characters and how desperate their struggle is. And that struggle can be anything really, like figuring out why you were wrongly imprisoned for 15 years.
That Terminator is out there. It can't be bargained with. It can't be reasoned with. It doesn't feel pity or remorse or fear, and it absolutely will not stop, ever, until you are dead.
Can you stop it?
I don't know. With these weapons, I don't know.
Now granted, this formula is a lot easier to follow when you're writing a more realistic story which may or may not be set in the real world. When you're creating sci-fi or fantasy works, however, you begin running into problems because magic and sci-fi gadgetry can provide easy solutions to whatever obstacle your protagonists might be dealing with. Which raises the question, how do you avoid this problem when writing fantasy stories? When you're dealing with magic, sci-fi gadgetry, and other elements which don't even exist in the real world, how do you avoid the dreaded Deus Ex Machina? Well, the answer to that is also quite simple. You need to establish those elements early on and clearly articulate for the audience how they can and will be used in your story. Or, as Brandon Sanderson, author of the Mistborn and Stormlight Archive novels so beautifully puts it, a writer's ability to solve conflict with magic in a satisfying way is directly proportional to how well the audience understands said magic.
And they're out there right now, plotting. Which is why I came back for you. Now is the perfect time to bird! Bird! Oh, come here, come here, come here. Oh, don't go up there. No, come here.
What is that? It's hog squeal.
Do birds live in these little houses?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's genius. Who thought of that? You can stick your tongue right in.
Hog squeal.
Give me the book now.
You want the book? Go get it!
And this, not incidentally, is also something which the original FF7 pulled off masterfully. Not only is the power differential between our heroes and our villain eloquently communicated to us through gameplay mechanics, but magic in 7's world is also tied to the planet, which means that if the planet cannot defend itself from the meteor threat, then neither can any amount of magic. Unless, that is, the only surviving ancient can cast a very particular spell at an altar, die, and then amplify the life stream from beyond the grave. But, in order for that plan to work, our heroes first need to defeat a genetically enhanced super soldier and his supernatural interdimensional alien mother, both of whom have sealed themselves in a cave and are tremendously more powerful than all of our party members combined. Oh yeah, and they only have 1 week to do so before the world gets destroyed. The combined result is an extremely intense narrative wherein our heroes have both limited time and limited means by which to succeed, and that's how it always manages to put you on the edge of your seat. And if you think about it, pretty much all of the best horror, action, and fantasy stories throughout history have all followed this exact same formula. Sure, they might not explain every meticulous detail of their magic systems, and sure, there might be some obvious contrivances here or there, but this is usually compensated for by having the characters be young learners whose overall experience is relatively limited, which in turn makes them more relatable to the audience. Conversely, the most impressive displays of power will only be shown coming from either the villains or old masters who eventually get killed off or otherwise unable to help our protagonists, which in turn just makes it all the more satisfying when our heroes do manage to succeed despite all odds being stacked against them. There's a reason, after all, why Frodo and Sam spend nearly the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy separated from Gandalf, why Captain Marvel was absent for most of the MCU, why the Vision, Doctor Strange, and Scarlet Witch were all killed off in Infinity War. Action scenes are at their best when the heroes are in danger, and one can only be in danger if they are somehow less capable or only equally as capable as their opponent. Thus, the fact remains that the more your heroes can use gadgets or other superhuman abilities to solve problems, the more you need to emphasize the costs and/or handicaps of using them.
The character is not skilled enough at their magic yet and needs to level up, or they need to find something that's not working in the magic and fix it. Or the magic can't solve this problem. It can maybe help me with the surrounding things, but I need to then find a way to solve this problem using my other attributes, not just my magic. And those are going to be your 3 paradigms for telling stories about the magic. There are others.
In other words, limitations are what create tension. That's a huge part of why the original game's narrative was so compelling. However, with Remake, any sense of desperation is gone now because there don't seem to be any limits on what the heroes can do anymore. How is a viewer supposed to care about any future conflicts they might face when seemingly no threat is too powerful for them to overcome? What does it matter whether anyone lives or dies when there's no guarantee that anything will be permanent? I mean, theoretically, Sephiroth and/or the Lifestream could just keep resetting the timeline indefinitely to create an infinite number of sequels/spin-offs, so why should we care what happens in the Remake timeline moving forward? Brief tangent here, but I for one liked Final Fantasy VII a lot more when the Lifestream was just a place to which souls went when they died, and from which monsters and magic could be summoned. I like it a lot less now that it's an omnidimensional super being which can resurrect the dead and alter the space-time continuum. Basically, Remake is exploiting the Lifestream in the same way that the Star Wars sequels abused the Force, as a cop-out to do whatever the writers feel like.
See, in the original trilogy, the Force was subtle and used sparingly, like when Luke hears Obi-Wan's voice in his head, and later sees his Force ghost, or when he uses Force pull to retrieve his lightsaber, and when Palpatine used Force lightning for the first time, it was like, holy shit, this guy's powerful. Now it's just been elevated to ridiculous levels. Now the Force can pluck spaceships out of the sky, heal fatal injuries, host Skype calls, teleport objects across the galaxy, and cast lightning bolts strong enough to disable entire war fleets. There's no limits, no rules, no indication of what's possible or not, so there's no way to buy into it. This is a world where you have no idea what anyone can do at any given time, so pretty soon you just stop caring.
It's a big plot hole because of the fact that it completely ruins death. There's no tension anymore. Death is a complete joke in this film. This person dies, comes back. This person dies, comes back. This person dies. So you do not give a shit when somebody dies.
They force healing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And not only that, but it completely ruins the series for the future. Like, you've got Force ghosts that can do stuff.
Grab lightsabers out of the air, lightning strikes, we got everything.
And now you've got force healing, which nobody can fucking die. I don't want to see episode 10. I don't want to see 11. I don't want to see 12 because they have to go away. They have to go into the past.
For a story to be engaging, the audience needs to feel invested in that story's universe. But when the viewer has no solid understanding of that universe or where its boundaries lie, then immersion becomes impossible and one is thus left unable to care. This is how I felt when playing through Final Fantasy XIII only a few years back, and I could feel the same process happening again during the final chapter of Remake. From the beginning of the game right up until the 17th chapter, I was on the edge of my seat. I was rooting for the characters, and I truly felt as though I was actually partaking in the narrative. It kinda began falling apart once they explained what the Fate Ghosts were, but it wasn't until the end of that highway, when Aerith started monologuing in a way which was completely out of character, that everything changed. From that point on, it didn't feel like I was forwarding the narrative. Rather, it felt like I was being dragged along by it. I could feel my overall engagement with the story just just rapidly withering away, and that feeling only grew stronger as the overall spectacle ramped up, because it's such an egregious case of too much too soon. This ending was just so over the top and contrary to what I'd come to expect from Seven's universe that I couldn't help but lose my suspension of disbelief while playing it. Now, sure, the entirety of Remake up until this point was already pretty ridiculous. We had characters summoning giant monsters to fight in battles. We had Cloud using comically oversized anime swords to fight a giant house monster. We had characters blatantly violating the laws of physics. And we had a massive city comprised of 2 separate levels, one stacked 300 meters on top of the other. But, as ridiculous as that all was, do you know what else we had? A general semblance of what the characters could not do. They could not bring people back from the dead, and they could not take on a giant representation of an abstract metaphysical concept. Not to mention that there were no alternate universes to speak of either. But then it concludes with our protagonist fighting Sephiroth, destroying a demigod in order to change the course of history, and in doing so, they resurrect characters who were supposed to have died already and even leave open the possibility of time travel and alternate universes. Simply put, this ending betrays what I as an audience member had already believed to be the rules of Seven's universe. It blatantly violates all 3 of Sanderson's laws, and in doing so leaves us without even the slightest semblance of what could possibly happen next. And that presents a serious threat to the franchise going forward, because if the writers are free to just make and unmake plot points on a whim, then it subconsciously informs the audience that they shouldn't bother to become invested in anything. This is why I don't find Barrett's revival and the Whisper's subsequent defeat reassuring. They've already brought Biggs and even Zack back from the dead, figuratively speaking, so how do we know that the same won't happen with Jesse or even Aerith at some point? They've already retconned Seven's universe to include alternate timeline tropes, so even with the Whispers being defeated, even if Aerith's death does occur, how can we trust the writers to not go back on their word later? How can we be certain that they won't just retcon the story again and invent some other means of bringing Aerith back regardless? This all brings us back around to what I said earlier about how fiction writers should not only provide a clear and consistent set of rules when creating fictional worlds, but also commit to never violating those rules under any circumstances. And that especially applies when and wherever resurrection and time travel are involved, because permanence is the most rudimentary limitation that a fictional world can have. How strong your villain is or how constrained your heroes are is completely trivial if, for all the audience knows, anything bad that happens in your story can just be undone at the writer's behest. In fact, I'm nearly positive that this is one of the core reasons why Terminator Dark Fate flopped at the box office. Why should we go out and see Terminator 6 when whatever happens in it will probably just be rendered moot by Terminator 7? This is also why the best stories which involve time travel nearly always impose limits on how and when the characters can use it. Often, their use of time travel will only make things worse, or be just as much the cause of their problems as it is the solution.
There was a plane crash. David, 77 people on board a flight from London to Madrid. It happened 5 days ago. Sarah Nathan's dad was the pilot. Whatever we did at Lollapalooza had some crazy ripple effects. Somehow we caused the basketball team to not make the playoffs. Our captain, he broke his leg on March 1st, right? And that affected the players, their parents. Sarah Nathan's brother, he was on the team, right? Yeah. Her dad was supposed to be at the game. He wasn't supposed to be flying that night.
We have to go back and make it so that we never jump there in the first place.
And the same goes for resurrection. If a character is revived, they'll either come back wrong, or by some rare magical ability that only works once. Or it'll be something that only the villains can do with some mysterious MacGuffin or whatever. The limits ensure that whatever happens in the story still has lasting ramifications, thereby retaining viewers' investment in the overall conflict. But in Remake, that is not the case anymore. There are no clearly defined limits on how and when the planet can resurrect people, nor the extent to which it and Sephiroth can reshape history. This all seems completely arbitrary depending on what the writers feel like doing, as if the only reason this stuff's even in the game is to facilitate it being a sequel and/or spare Zack from death. And when a writer has already pulled that trick once, who's to say they aren't just going to pull it again later? Superhero comics have had this issue since at least as far back as the 80s, when they finally ran out of characters to kill off, at which point the only way they could keep the stories going was to start resurrecting the dead only to kill them off over and over again. And Square could easily do that with FF7 now that the planet is omnitemporal. In fact, it seems any franchise that goes on long enough is doomed to start resurrecting the dead, traveling through time, or exploring the multiverse at some point for this exact reason. They're excuses for cannon fodder. Franchise writers only turn to these tropes when they have run out of things to blow up, at which point the only way they can keep the story going is to reset everything before blowing it up again. Rinse and repeat. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why many fiction fans, myself included, are of the unwritten belief that the moment you add any of these tropes to a franchise, then nothing which happens in the story matters anymore. It is all downhill from there. It will never be good again. It has officially jumped the shark. There's a reason, after all, why the word consequence is also a synonym for important.
A multiverse does not automatically destroy audience investment, but it is an extremely convenient shortcut if the writer wants an in-universe mechanism for retcons. If you do this, it's usually a sign that the writer is contriving a way out of a corner they've written themselves into. Once that concept is introduced into the setting, it can't be unintroduced. The writer, and every writer that comes after them, now has permanent access to a reset button, and the audience therefore knows that nothing in canon is set in stone anymore. You've set a precedent for a way to completely change the universe out from under them, and now they have no reason to trust anything you do in the future. You can give them, oh, look, I'm resolving this romantic subplot, isn't that great? And the audience is like, I've already seen you give me this and rip it away from me before. I have no reason to care that this happened, because I don't know it's going to be permanent. I just don't like it when a story gives me a big pile of fun things to get invested in, and then punishes me for caring about 90% of them.
The point is, whether one does or does not know what happens in a narrative is completely trivial when there's no reliable way to tell what matters from what doesn't. And that really is the core problem with Remake's story. It's not even clear what's at stake anymore. That has been left entirely up for the theory crafters to figure out. And best of respects to them, but for players like myself who just want an enthralling narrative to follow, Remake's mysteries don't add to the experience at all. They only take away from it by raising questions that no one should have been asking in the first place. In fact, given the huge number of fans who seem to have taken these theories as gospel, I can almost guarantee that if it weren't for all the lore masters out there, Remake's story changes would be a lot more hated than they already are. Well, for some players that is. For others, it's been the exact opposite. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why this ending devastated me so much. Remember how early in the video I said this? The issue is in how the ending recontextualizes the story in a way which ruined many players' experiences. Endings are arguably the most important part of any narrative after all, because they provide the very payoff to which everything else in the story has been building up to that point. If you screw up the ending and thereby recontextualize things for the worse, it cripples the experience overall. It makes viewers feel as though all their time and investment was for nothing. The contexts in which story beats occur are just as important, if not more, than the individual plot points themselves. And this? I get that most of you Maximilian fans out there are just trying to help those of us who were disappointed by the ending. However, for me personally, Max's theories might have actually made things worse. Well, that's important for what comes next. See, Maximilian Dude's theories might have brought a ton of fans around to Remake's new direction, but for myself and others, Max's theories, specifically the ones involving parallel universes, are one of the main reasons why we were so hurt by this ending. Simply put, the existence of a Final Fantasy VII multiverse would inherently imply that Remake is itself set in a different universe from the original game, that its characters are not the same characters whom I know and love from the OG, just nondescript alternate reality counterparts. And that revelation, the moment I heard it, was enough to ruin the entire game for me, because I simply do not care about anything that happens in alternate universes. Remember how Star Ocean 3 managed to ruin the entire series by revealing that it was all taking place inside an MMO? Or how in the third birthday it was revealed that you'd been playing as Eve the whole time, after which the game forces you to kill Aya? Or to any viewers over the age of 40 who may be watching this video, remember how the show Dallas managed to ruin an entire season by revealing that it was all just a dream? Well, that is what the ending felt like for me, that it had all been for nothing. And that feeling was only made worse by the fact that so much of this game was exactly what I wanted out of a remake. As I said earlier, I loved the gameplay, I loved the characters, I loved the presentation. It was one of the best gaming experiences that I'd had in years. But then the ending came along to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory by revealing that these characters with whom I'd spent the past 45 hours were not the same characters that I've come to love and adore all these years, but rather they're doppelgangers from some other universe out there. And if that really is the case, if Remake truly is set in a different universe from the original game, then I couldn't care less about what happens in it. Hell, they could... And I still wouldn't care because, again, it's just an alternate universe. That is how much this ending hurt my enjoyment of the game and my reverence for the characters. The opposite of love, after all, is not just hate, but indifference. And if a considerable portion of your audience is left feeling indifferent towards both your story and its characters, you have failed at storytelling.
There's a very specific reason on this many-headed beast to why this game disillusioned and disenfranchised me. Problem with these alternate universe / divergent timeline tropes that Nomura is obsessed with is that unless you're a very clever writer, it's incredibly easy to make your characters feel expendable. I think this fatal side effect of these tropes is the core reason why a lot of people hate this ending. For instance, Cloud Strife is no longer the Cloud Strife, he's just a Cloud Strife. I don't care about what happens to this dude because you told me he's an alternate universe doppelganger. I don't care what happens to any of these people now. I know I'm using deadpan for comedic effect, but I'm legitimately sad right now. For real, I'm saying little Popeye-armed Lego-looking Cloud from 1997 has more emotional presence to me than this Cloud with all his millions of polygons, superb voice acting, and lifelike animation because of misguided tropes that are woefully misplaced in the world of FF7. I don't care about this Cloud. I care about this Cloud even less. Let this new third universe crawl under the porch and die like the sick possum that it is.
Now, fortunately, however, I don't think that a multiverse is what we're actually looking at here anymore. See, in the time it's taken me to make this video, I've recovered from that initial impression. I think what's far more plausible is that the writers are instead going for a single universe wherein history has been overwritten as a result of fate being altered, aka the Back to the Future approach to time travel rather than the Avengers Endgame approach. Whether Remake is canonically related to the original game or not seems to be a matter of preference. Personally, I like to think of the OG and Remake as being two completely separate canons which have no metaphysical relationship to each other whatsoever, but that's just me. Come to think of it, it would perhaps even be better if they just didn't provide an answer to this question at all, because it really is one of those damned if you do, damned if you don't type scenarios. I mean, on the one hand, if there is only one universe, and yet it is a canonical sequel to the original, then that implies that the Remake timeline is also erasing the original game's timeline from existence, which is definitely not ideal. But on the other hand, if it's just an alternate universe, then the entire Remake series is pointless. These characters aren't the characters that I know and love. I honestly think it would be best if they just didn't try to answer this question at all. Maybe put out an interview saying that each individual player is free to decide for themselves which option is the least horrible for them. At the very least, it would avoid drawing further attention to all the plot holes which these time travel elements create. As for myself, well, the separate canons approach is not without its issues. Namely, it still raises questions as to whether any future plot points will be permanent or not, but there is still time for future entries to rectify that issue. I can at least tolerate history being rewritten so long as we get clear assurance that it will never happen again. For instance, if killing Genova alters the nature of the lifestream in such a way that its interdimensional powers are permanently busted, therefore they cannot reset time or resurrect anyone ever again. What I cannot accept is the notion that these characters are just alternate universe knockoffs of the ones that I actually care about. I mean, to be honest, I've kind of disliked the concept of alternate universes ever since I was a kid watching Spider-Man the Animated Series, and I kind of stopped taking the MCU seriously as far back as the first Avengers movie in 2012. Because the moment Loki brought aliens to Earth, I realized they're eventually going to start hopping through time, resurrecting the dead, or exploring the multiverse at some point, just like their source material. So I might as well just jump ship now. And jump I did. Every Marvel film since, I've watched as a comedy, with perhaps the occasional moment of drama. But that's not what FF7 is to me. Final Fantasy VII is, first and foremost, a drama with the occasional moment of comedy. And thus, bad comic book tropes are the last possible thing I would ever want added into that story. That's not to imply that you can't tell a dramatic story involving parallel universes. You can. There are good multiverse stories out there, and some of them are very dramatic. My point is that no matter how hard anyone tries, no one, I repeat, no one will ever get me to care about an alternate universe version of Cloud Strife. I only care about the Cloud Strife, the one whom I know and love from both the original game and the compilation. Any alternate universe versions of him might as well be dead for all I care.
Ours is the only reality of consequence.
Now, like I said, I don't think a multiverse is what the devs are going for here. And just to clarify, I do not blame Maximilian for this. The polarizing impact which he's had on how players feel about the game was obviously not intentional on his part. I do not hold any hard feelings against him, nor do I wish to imply that theory crafting is bad in any way. However, what the divisive reactions to his theories demonstrate is that Remake relies too heavily on lore masters to keep audiences invested. Because it is so devoid of clarity, many players, myself included, were or have essentially been forced into taking popular theories as fact, regardless of whether we like them or not, and things just spiraled out of control from there. Possibly the worst example of this concerns the so-called meta implications of the Arbiters. See, some critics have interpreted the Whispers to be a metaphor for those fans who are expecting a faithful retelling of the original game's story, since they're trying to keep all of its major plot points on track. By this account, then, their eventual defeat by the heroes is a sort of triumph over the original game's bad ending, as well as a deliberate fuck you from the developers, that it was their way of sticking it to all those entitled fans who dared expect them to tell the same story again, which... Okay, another tangent, but I really need to address this. To all the Remake fans out there who are making this argument, that's a really shitty thing to do. First of all, it's simply not correct. The Whispers are, more or less, a force of good in this story. They're trying to ensure that the party beats Sephiroth in order to save the planet, after all. Second, it is highly conceited to think that all the hard work and effort the devs put into this game was just a ruse to piss off old-school fans while making your self-righteous ass happy. And third, unfavorably comparing any group of fans to some villain which must be destroyed is actually rather creepy. It borders on wishing death onto someone, which, by the way, is exactly how a lot of fans interpreted this battle. Oh yes, that wasn't just a joke amongst the player base. Many fans, myself included, genuinely thought that the Whisper's defeat was a wanton death threat from the developers, that it was their way of saying, fuck the fans for getting in the way of their creative freedom. Some might say we're the egotists for interpreting it that way, but can you really blame us when so many Remake fans were parroting this argument unironically? The on-the-nose dialogue certainly doesn't help in that regard.
What will we find on the other side?
Freedom. Boundless, terrifying freedom. We can change it. Make it right.
Let the past die. Kill it, if you have to. That's the only way to become what you were meant to be.
Now, fortunately, I don't think that was the reason for the Whisper's inclusion anymore. I honestly think they were added simply because the devs thought it was a cool story idea, and so that the Midgar arc could have a final boss rush at the end, which raises the question as to why Sephiroth had to be included as well. but the point still stands. The Whisper's defeat being an intentional fuck you to fans is a really sick claim to be making. It's bad enough to walk away from this game thinking it was all a waste, but to be told it was all a sadistic prank on the part of the developers just makes it worse.
As much as it might seem that this is a comment by the developers on how awful it is to deal with the fans of the series though, I'd argue it's better to interpret them as the pressures of fan expectation. By the framing of the story, these time ghosts aren't intrinsically good or bad. They're overall indifferent to the morality of how they affect things, considering they help the main party as much as hinder them. Since the game came out, there's been a sentiment floating around that Nomura did all this maliciously. That he and his team were spitting in the face of fans with little regard to what they were doing so that they could pursue their own fanfiction. But I think more than anyone, Nomura and his fellow devs understand how important FF7 is. It's clear that even Nomura's team themselves were apprehensive of what they were doing, knowing the weight of the project.
But I guess that's the sort of thing that happens when a game is this open-ended. Fans are going to project whatever biases they have onto it and thus go to war over the pettiest of arguments, none of which was helped by the devs' total silence on the matter. Believe me, Square could have done a lot of damage control if they'd put out an interview clarifying that this was not intended as an insult to fans. But to be fair, they too probably thought it was just a joke and didn't realize that some were actually interpreting it that way.
Can you think of what pressure in the world might push back against changes to the story of the original Final Fantasy VII? Of course, the answer is fans of the original game. We are the villains stifling the creativity of a team that just wants to turn a beloved story into a meta-narrative train wreck. It's guided by a cynical, bordering on adversarial approach to the fandom. The people who made it possible by purchasing 11 million copies of the original.
They essentially told us that the entire story and the ending and the conclusion, the climax of the original game was we got the bad ending of a game. We got what was not supposed to happen, which is like, fuck you. Final Fantasy VII, the original, was a masterpiece. There's a reason why it was so good and people loved it so much. There's a reason why everyone wanted a remake. I'm done. I'm not buying the next installment of the game. I'm done, guys. I'm not supporting this anymore.
In any case, hopefully you can understand where a lot of people are coming from by now. This game didn't hurt solely because it killed my investment in 7's world and characters. It hurt because it made me feel betrayed, ostracized, abandoned. Like the fanbase, which I had been a part of for years, had decided overnight that I wasn't welcome anymore. Basically, almost every single negative impression which this ending and its resultant theories could have left on fans hit me all at once. If anything, Remake should serve as a case study in how writers can go too far in trying to provoke discussion and encourage viewers to ask questions. What am I supposed to be caring about in this story, and was this meant as an insult against me, are not questions which any writer should want audience members to ask. Leaving fans so desperate for clarity that they're forced into taking internet theories as gospel is a guaranteed way to polarize your audience. Not to mention it sets a large portion of them up for disappointment when forthcoming entries don't go the way they've theorized it to. And of course, as all this is happening, those fans who just want a good story to follow are left dealing with the fallout.
I know a lot of people wanted to play it because they didn't want to play an old RPG, but since there are so many changes to the story, especially the end, I'm not sure if I can recommend it. A lot of the remake does rely on you knowing the original, so I have trouble recommending it to new people.
This new Sephiroth then teleports Cloud to the end of all creation to ask him for his help. Whether this is actually a legitimate offer on Sephiroth or Genova or whatever, whoever's part, is completely ambiguous, but you do have to explain why his motivation has changed from cleansing the planet to try to keep the entire universe from dying out. I don't believe that the entire reason Sephiroth is trying to change fate is so that he doesn't lose. I don't exactly know his character that much, as I've never played the original, but he really doesn't sound like the kind of guy who even cares about winning. For people like me playing Final Fantasy VII at all for the first time, it's just confusing as hell. I don't know what's going on, what it means, or what the implications are. And I know that's supposed to be intriguing and get me hyped for a sequel, but all it really did was devalue my entire gameplay experience.
Bottom line, how invested you can remain in the remake series at this point is far too dependent not just on how engaged you are with the theory crafting community, but also on whether you like or dislike the theories in question. And that's a real problem when you're telling a multi-part story and your goal is to keep as many people excited for the forthcoming entries as you can, because the fact is, not every gamer is interested in theory crafting. I can guarantee you that there are a lot of remake players out there who simply do not care about all the Reddit forums and YouTube channels which are dedicated to this sort of thing. All they want is an experience which they can just sit down and enjoy without having to decipher all the plot points on their own. Heck, they may not even care enough to leave comments or even respond to surveys asking what people thought of the game, so there could be an element of selection bias to these polls. Now, I'm not saying that that is definitely what's going on here. Obviously, there's no way to tell what percentage of the fan base these people actually comprise, but my point is that alienating any particular subset of your audience is the last thing you want to do when you're a AAA publisher with hundreds of millions of dollars and 20+ years of fan expectations on the line. Leaving the first part in your series on a cliffhanger so that fans can speculate as to what might happen next is one thing, but leaving things on such an ambiguous note that viewers are instead left wondering what even happened or why they should care? That's something else entirely.
What I would argue about Bloodborne is you don't need to come to that realization to have a very fulfilling experience. It is dense enough that whether you're at level 1 or level 4, you're getting something out of it. It comes through the execution and the presentation. I haven't seen Advent Children in a long time, but I've seen Advent Children multiple times, and I feel like I usually walk away from Advent Children
not great,
feeling very unfulfilled. And it's
great.
like, yeah, you can go down the rabbit hole and you can come to the fulfillment of those revelations, but actually sitting there and watching the movie, it doesn't come across very well.
So what's happening is Sephiroth is going back and changing the events of Final Fantasy VII. He's changing the fans' memories of the game. And when you take that into account, what I would say is I don't fucking care. I've listened to the podcast. I've read all the I understand all this stuff. No part of what I'm saying, I'm not saying this stuff doesn't make sense. My problem is when you come out the other side of it, I don't see how it's a good story. I don't see what it's saying that's good. And you might say, oh, well, in the next game, they're going to justify it. I don't give anyone that much faith. And even if they do, I don't think anyone is ever... nothing could justify how fucking bad I think the ending of this game is and how weak the storytelling is. And I get that it's fun to theory craft this stuff. I get that it's fun to speculate. And if you're right, I bet it feels really good. But I also... that's not storytelling to me. If that is your thing, this is the perfect game for you. To me, it takes away so much and it adds so little.
And need I say anything about Final Fantasy XV at this point? You know, the game whose story was divided across several trailers, an anime series, numerous DLC, a feature-length film, and a frigging novel? I mean, don't get me wrong, I still love the game and will defend it to my grave, but holy crap was it ever a salvage project if I've seen one. Overall, I guess this at least partially explains why Remake's ending feels so incongruous. It's because, ironically, for a man who openly admits to restricting players' freedoms for the sake of having a coherent story, neither Toriyama, nor Nomura, Nojima, Kitase, nor indeed most of the people currently working at Square Enix really seem to know how to tell one coherently. I could go on, but you probably get the point by now, so let us wrap all this up for the time being. I apologize if this doesn't feel like the strongest note to end things on. In fact, some of you are probably thinking, that's it? I mean, yeah, he did cover a lot already, but what about Remake's new themes potentially betraying those of the original? Well, my original plan was to save those points for part 2, but that's looking less and less likely now given the insane amount of time and effort this has taken out of me already. True, a follow-up would be more efficient to make now that I have a clear semblance of what I'm doing, but it's unlikely I'd be able to get it out in time before Rebirth launches. Besides, most of what I'd planned to discuss in part 2 is speculative, about where the writers could go with the story, so it's probably not worth putting as much time and effort into. More importantly though, for all that I've talked shit about the new direction, I do still hope that it will win me back in the end. No, really. If they can tone down the obvious plot armor and also change the life stream one final time so that it can never be used to retcon anything ever again, then most of my contentions with this story will be resolved. For example, if we were to learn that Genova is the source of all this, that she somehow tainted the life stream with her interdimensional powers after getting thrown into the Mako reactor at Nibelheim, I think I'd be okay with that. Out of all the theories I've heard, it would certainly make the most sense given what else has been established thus far. It would explain why the planet is omnitemporal, how it was able to create the Whispers, how Barrett got resurrected, how Sephiroth came back from the dead in Advent Children, why he can manipulate the Whispers, why the 3 Arbiters you fight at the end are the souls of Sephiroth's remnants, and, most importantly, it would imply that killing Genova would purge her influence from the life stream, thus shattering its omnitemporality and ensuring that nothing can ever be changed ever again.
The other cool thing about timeline resets is that they're not actually always bad. And my go-to example for this is X-Men Days of Future Past. The reset begins in the extremely far, terrible future. You know, the universe is a blasted purple-colored hellscape. We probably don't actually want to end up here. The reset timeline takes place in the past with a new cast. The things that they mostly reset were writing decisions that nobody liked. And I think possibly most crucially, they didn't do it more than once, and there's no way for them to do it again. Because the way the timeline reset works is that in the distant future, Kitty Pryde's mutant power allows her to send someone's consciousness back in time, but it's not like she can still do that in the timeline that Wolverine wakes up in at the very end of the movie. And the fact that they didn't do that basically saved them from almost every other bad thing that can happen with a timeline reset plot.
I mean, I still dislike the inclusion of these tropes on principle, but if that's the direction this ends up going, if destroying Genova permanently alters the nature of the life stream one final time, definitively establishing that no past events can ever be changed ever again, I might, just might, be able to tolerate that. So ultimately, I'd rather wait until this story is finished before I make my final analysis. And if parts 2 and 3 do manage to win me back, then perhaps I'll make a follow-up video detailing how and why they managed to do so, against all probability. In the meantime, though, Square Enix needs to be very careful moving forward, because the tropes which they've added to this story have little margin for error, and thus run a high risk of this series ending in disaster. Now, I could be wrong about that, of course. I hope I'm wrong, in fact. For all that I know, parts 2 and onward could stick the landing regardless. Or maybe you felt that my arguments here just weren't very well substantiated. Heck, one might try and argue that I'm just pessimistic and therefore motivated to suspect this series will fail. And you know, you may not be wrong about that. In fact, that seems to be a running theme in this whole controversy, that how excited/worried you are for the forthcoming installments is directly correlated with how optimistic/pessimistic you are, either towards Square Enix and Final Fantasy, or as a person more generally. I, of course, am on the pessimistic end of that spectrum, and it's not as if there aren't good reasons for that. I'm hardly the first to mention this, but for myself and others, Remake was often at its best when it was either adapting or expanding on elements that were already present in the OG, and often at its worst when adding entirely new elements which were either poorly executed or just didn't feel like they belonged in 7's universe. And so the fact that this series will now be going in an original direction because of those elements does not excite me in the slightest. Even if they stick more to the original game's plot moving forward, they could still bugger up only 10% of that plot and nevertheless ruin the player's experience. Believe me, I know. Yes, there are a ton of things which Remake does right, particularly in regards to characterization. Unfortunately, great scenes and characters alone do not make a good story. No matter how good those moments are, they need to work as part of a whole. And Remake's ending changes, in my opinion, thoroughly undermine the whole. So, yeah, the fact that 90% of this game was an almost perfect adaptation of the original does nothing to alleviate my concerns, and the fact that these guys have repeatedly proven themselves to be the worst time travel writers in the history of storytelling hasn't exactly helped much either.
If you change the future, you change the past. You can remold history as your heart desires.
It's ironic that the developers are now tinkering with the narrative in part to encourage speculation and keep viewers invested during the lead up to Rebirth in Part 3, but breaking viewers' immersion and pissing off anywhere between 12 to 30% of your fan base is a pretty good way of ensuring that a lot of people won't stick around for the remaining installments. And I don't think it's unfair to suggest that that number is only going to increase with time, because the writers at Square have given themselves the improbable task of trying to appease one set of fans who still want an at least semi-faithful retelling of the original, another set which has now spent so much time theory crafting that whether the devs can live up to their expectations is dubious at best, and a third set who only wish for a well-told story and otherwise don't really care about all the Reddit forums and YouTube channels which are dedicated to this sort of thing. All told, Remake's problem is that it is sacrificing narrative harmony for the sake of doing something different. It is trying to be a remake, a reboot, a sequel, and an adaptation all at the same time, and it is doing so in ways which end up compromising the player's immersion. Even now, roughly 2 years after its release, I still feel the same way towards Remake as I did towards Final Fantasy XIII the first time I played it. More baffled than intrigued, and not even sure whether I'll be continuing with the story at this point. Especially since it's looking to be a PS5 exclusive, and I'll be damned if I'm gonna pick one of those up anytime soon. So, if parts 2 and 3 come along and both end up seeing major dips in sales because of all this, well, then the writers at Square have no one to blame but themselves. But again, who knows what the future may bring. Besides, even if there is an obvious drop in sales for Part 2 and 3, I am confident that they will still draw in enough revenue to make Square a profit, and or that their exclusivity deal with Sony will cover the expenses. Whether their critical success lives up to their commercial success, however, well, that remains to be seen. I want to love this series. I wouldn't have made this video if I didn't, and I wish I could be excited for Rebirth. But I can't, because if there's one thing the past 20 years of Squenix games have proven to me, it's that I cannot trust these people's judgment when it comes to story decisions anymore. Not even when they have a perfectly well-formed one to draw from. I get that the devs wanted to try something different, explore new ideas rather than just tread the same story again, but I'm not one to give them credit for that, because the fact is, ideas alone are not good enough. Execution is just as important. Coming up with story concepts is easy after all. Properly executing those concepts is much more difficult. And that is what all the Golden Age Final Fantasies achieved so well. Yes, they had wild plots with many Kingdom Hearts-style concepts underpinning them, but they were presented through well-paced narratives which had a perfect sense of time, place, and tone. They had enough world building and backstory to get you invested, and always knew exactly which details needed clarifying for viewers. More recent FF and Kingdom Hearts games, meanwhile, have suffered constantly from poor plotting, a lack of congruity, and the need for supplementary materials to understand anything. Their approach to storytelling can be summarized as just throw a bunch of concepts at the player and hope that something sticks, regardless of whether it feels harmonious or not. That is Remake's final chapter in a nutshell, and why it feels so detached from the rest of the game. It's an over-glorified proof of concept trailer, an ungodly mishmash of fate and time travel ideas thrown together with little order or context, forced into a plot and world which was never built to accommodate them in the first place. And I am not the sort of person who can just embrace chaos as it comes and goes. I need structure. Good writing, pacing, in-universe plausibility, high-stakes tension and drama, relatable themes, and characters in whose struggles I am invested are the things I care about most in storytelling, and Remake's final chapter is, in my opinion, an abomination of every one of those things.
Here's the problem with Square Enix right now. Number one, their upper management has been, just abysmal for the last almost 2 decades. But because of that, because of the upper level struggles, I feel like the most talented storytellers and directors that were in that company all fled. Tetsuya Takahashi, Yasumi Matsuno, Hironobu Sakaguchi, all gone. And now we're left with guys who are all great concept people, great with concepts, It has nothing to do with how good they are at coming up with great ideas, and has everything to do with how they edit scenes, write the dialogue, pace the story, when they decide to use humor or fan service, how they resolve conflicts in the end, the plot holes, not thinking through things, extremely well. So if you're a person who loved the storytelling of 1990s Squaresoft, these people aren't there anymore. And the people who have risen up to fill their place are not storytellers. I'm sorry, they're just not. They're concept artists, they're battle system directors. The hype for these projects comes from visual excitement. They look really amazing. The concepts, the designs are all immaculate. And that's basically where the substance of these things ends.
In theory, this ending could have worked for me on some level had its changes been better implemented, but it didn't, because even when judging this game as a sequel/reboot rather than an adaptation, it still has numerous execution problems. From its sudden change of premise to its disregard for power scaling, from its openly encouraging viewers to ask questions about time travel, to the hero's lack of reason for defying destiny, from its not leaving us with anything to root for, to the fact that some even wound up interpreting it as a death threat toward fans. Each of these would be bad enough on their own, but the fact that the devs didn't even seem to notice these incredibly obvious issues, that they seem to think the ending was the best part of the game, is one of the main reasons why I can't trust them. If they were going to do something this radical to the story, if they were going to so massively overhaul the rules of 7's universe while still leaving me excited for what comes next, they had to prove to me that they could pull it off without a hitch, that they could still write something which was just as good as, or at least complementary to what the original game already offered. Suffice to say, they failed. I honestly don't even care about what the heroes are fighting over, nor whether their lives are threatened anymore. I am only intellectually curious as to where they will end up, but emotionally, I feel almost no investment whatsoever, and I think that speaks volumes to how badly the writers dropped the ball on this one. The point of any work of art, after all, is to instill thoughts and/or emotions in someone else, be they joy, horror, fear, anger, sorrow, catharsis, and even introspection. Thus, I'd argue that the worst possible thing a work of art can do is either fail to leave any impression whatsoever, or take every emotion which it already instilled in viewers and then render them all for naught. A story in which I no longer feel invested is, almost by definition, a story without conflict. And a story without conflict is an oxymoron.
When I see a character die in this movie, I don't feel scared. I don't feel sympathy. I'm not even entertained. I feel nothing other than apathy. I simply do not care in the slightest if a character lives or dies. And that's the worst thing a movie can do. Make the viewer not care when they see a human being die. It's desensitizing. If anything, I feel disturbed by the fact that when I watch another person get their head bit off by a monster, I feel no emotion whatsoever. It is wrong to feel uninterested, indifferent, and bored when you see somebody die. But that's what this movie does to you.
Thus, with all that in mind, my plan going forward is to wait until this series is concluded and then read up on all the spoilers and story changes before I decide whether to get reinvested or not. Because, as I've alluded to earlier, spoilers do not matter to me. What does matter to me is whether or not the story is good in the end. And even if Rebirth does manage to win me back, I still can't trust these people not to unintentionally ruin it in Part 3. And I know that may seem rather uncharitable towards the devs, but it wouldn't be the first time that they managed to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. Final Fantasy sequels are practically infamous for either retconning or in some way invalidating the stories of their predecessors, and the remake trilogy now appears to be heading in the same direction. By making the planet omnitemporal, these writers have given themselves free rein to unmake plot points at whim. The characters and world are now conduits for the writer's will. So, even if they swear in interviews that they will not resurrect any more dead characters or change history ever again, I still won't believe them. It won't be until I know how the story wraps up, when the writers have finally put their pencils down forever and cannot retcon anything ever again, that I will at last take it at face value once more. Which is pretty sad, to be honest. The ability to tell what, if anything, matters in a story should not be something which only becomes clear to viewers in retrospect. But I guess that's what happens when you cry wolf too many times. Nobody believes a liar, even if he's telling the truth. Honestly, I wish I wasn't so skeptical. I wish I could just enjoy the story at face value, same as everyone else. But that is simply not possible for me when I am constantly wondering what the author is going to pull out of thin air at a given moment. When there are no clearly defined limits on what magic or sci-fi gadgetry can do, I as a viewer am forced to suspect that they will always be able to change whatever the author wants. There's a difference, after all, between an unreliable narrator and an unreliable writer. That difference being that unreliable narrators don't destroy your immersion. But when viewers do stop feeling immersed in your plot, world, and characters, when they instead become conscious of what you, the writer, are doing, that, as I've explained at length, is practically the textbook definition of breaking a viewer's suspension of disbelief, which is a rudimentary failure of storytelling. Thus, I feel confident in saying, with utmost conviction, that the new narrative of the remake sequel trilogy is not just uncalled for, it is, in my honest opinion, completely antithetical to the very nature of storytelling itself, aka the very thing that Final Fantasy was always meant to be in the first place.
The game and the writers have made it clear, this ending is for those who know this universe. But as a result of this, they've forgotten about the characters in this game, the characters that this story has been about since the beginning. It's rather ironic, as the character's decision to combat destiny doesn't feel like it's actually their choice. By attempting to give this story agency to move in new directions, it took all agency away from the characters at the center of it.
It's such a loud solution to the issue that calls so much attention to the fact that it is a story.
Yeah.
That even that alone, regardless of how well they actually wrote it, the fact that they framed it in such a way of like, look at this metatextual thing that we're doing, it automatically takes people a layer out because they're not thinking about the story, it's thinking about the process of writing the story, which is what a lot of the discourse around the Marvel movies have been lately, is like, how are they gonna write this? As opposed to, what are the characters gonna do?
I honestly hope they turn it all around. I wanted to love this series very badly, and I hate the way I feel about it right now. Because Final Fantasy VII Remake is not a story. It's a story about a story, and that's the last thing I wanted from this. Nomura's tampering is a constant reminder that you're just playing a video game. It's sad what happens when a story becomes too famous for its own good.
And really, I suppose that gets at the root of why I'm not on board with this new direction. The original FF7 was, all told, an immersive story about characters on a quest to save the world. Remake is a fourth wall-breaking story about game writers on a quest to outsmart the internet. These changes feel like they exist not to elevate players' enjoyment, but to placate the developer's ego, as if they cared more about showing off how smart they think they are than they do about providing an immersive experience. Whether that really is their intention or not, I will reserve judgment, but it is definitely not what I wanted out of this series. Thus, between that and everything else I've covered in this critique, I'd much rather wait until I know how this story ends before I decide if it's worth sinking any more time and money into. If spoiling all the twists for myself ahead of time is what it takes to get my immersion back, then so be it. Until then, I would like to thank you for having stuck with me during this critique, and though you may not have come to agree with it, hopefully you at least have a more informed understanding as to why so many players were upset by these changes. You likely won't be seeing me again until this series is finished around 4 or 5 years from now, so in the meantime, here's to hoping for the best, but bracing for the worst. God bless.